They pushed the temp maid into the mute matriarch's room because the entire kitchen staff of the Kane estate wanted something to laugh about before lunch. Sadie Cole was the quiet single mother in a borrowed apron, the one the household staff called too poor, too timid, and too replaceable for anyone to bother remembering her name. For 4 years, the old lady of the estate had not made a single sound. Only her thin hands drew signs into the air signs the family dismissed as the old woman's episodes. No one bothered to look. But she heard everything, every burst of laugh down the hallway, every word they said about her, because her condition had taken her voice, not her ears. That morning, the laughter died, because the maid did not back out of the room like everyone before her. She stood still, looked straight at the old woman's trembling hands and answered. Not just in fluent sign language, but in a private code that only 2 people left on this earth had ever known. The first was standing in that room. The second had been lying in a flag-draped casket for 4 years. The old woman seized her wrist, pulled away the faded fabric band, and froze at the sight of a small falcon tattoo, like a mark someone had tried very hard to forget. At that exact moment, a voice came from the doorway, low, cold, accustomed to an entire city falling silent when it spoke. Who gave you permission to touch my mother? Ronan Kane, a man even the chief of police had to make an appointment to see, had no idea that the staff's cruel little game that morning had just opened the first crack in a secret buried with his brother's casket, and he knew even less of this. The woman in the apron standing in his mother's room was the last dying message his brother had ever sent home, carried on his final breath. If stories of quiet souls carrying a lifetime of storms make you want to listen to the very end, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel, then step with us through the gates of the Kane estate. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the old apartment complex on the eastern edge of Ashport was still sunk in a darkness thick with the smell of sea salt. In the one-room apartment on the 4th floor, Sadie Cole was already awake. She was always awake before dawn, a habit her body refused to forget, even though she had spent 4 years trying to forget it. She stood beside the small electric stove, cooking the last packet of noodles left in the cupboard, and doing the things she did every morning, with the practiced skill of someone who had turned survival into a craft. She lifted all the egg and the few thin slices of sausage into the pink bowl, with the picture of a ceramic rabbit with one chipped ear, Poppy's bowl. What remained, clear noodle broth with a few strands of scallion, she kept for herself. On top of the refrigerator, the glass jar with a crooked handwritten label reading Poppy's Christmas sat silent and still. The jar had once been heavy with loose change and bills folded into quarters. Now it was empty all the way to the bottom, transparent as a reminder that didn't need to speak. Sadie didn't look at it. She had learned that some things hurt more the longer you looked at them, so it was best to pass them by quickly. At 5:45, her phone vibrated. A message from Beacon Staffing, the service company that handed out work to her day by day, like handing out lottery tickets. The location for the day was only announced on the very morning the job began. That was their rule, and today the line of text that appeared made Sadie's fingers freeze in midair. Ravenhill Mansion, the Kane family, 1-week contract, janitorial position. She read it 3 times. In this city, the name Kane wasn't a name. It was a stretch of water that boats knew enough to avoid. And Sadie had more reasons than anyone in Ashport to stay away from that water. But refusing a job at the last minute meant Beacon would cross her off the list. And someone crossed off the list didn't have another packet of noodles to split in half. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, then sent back 2 words, I accept. At 7 o'clock, Poppy sat perched on the plastic chair, her cheeks puffed out around the last bite of egg, her little feet swinging to some song only she could hear. She was 6 years old, her hair tied into 2 uneven pigtails on purpose, because that morning she had insisted on tying them herself. She pushed the bowl of noodle broth toward her mother, frowning in the way of a tiny grown woman. Mommy, you're only eating broth. Sadie smiled, the smile she had practiced until it was perfect. I eat at work, baby. They cook really well there. Poppy nodded, believing her instantly, because 6-year-old children always believe their mothers, and that kind of faith was both a gift and a sentence for the mother who was lying. Before leaving home, Sadie sat down to retie her shoelaces. The toes of her work shoes had been peeling since the winter before, patched back together with a layer of clear glue spread so evenly it was almost invisible. Neat as the hands of someone who had glued them many times, who knew every crack in them by heart the way she knew every crack in her own life. In front of the elementary school gate, Poppy stepped off bus number 16 with her backpack on, ran 3 steps, then spun around. She lifted her little hand, spreading her thumb, index finger, and pinky into the sign for I love you, but as always, her pinky curled halfway down, turning the sign into a version that belonged only to Poppy in all the world. Sadie had never corrected her. Some mistakes were so lovely that correcting them would be a crime. She raised her own hand in answer, every angle of her fingers precise, and stood watching until the pink backpack disappeared behind the blue-painted iron gate. Then the smile on her face slowly went out, as if someone had turned down a lamp. Just before 8 o'clock, the bus dropped Sadie at the foot of the hill on the northern side of the city. Ravenhill appeared behind a row of old oaks, a massive block of gray stone looking down over Ashport Bay through windows as cold as the eyes of a night-hunting bird. The iron gate was 3 times taller than a person, its patterns twisted into the shape of black ravens. Sadie stood there longer than someone looking for work ought to stand. Every instinct in her screamed for her to turn back, that stepping through this gate meant stepping into the very water she had spent 4 years swimming away from. But behind her was the glass jar empty to the bottom, the last packet of noodles left behind on the breakfast table that morning. And ahead of her, deep inside her chest, a 4-year-old debt stirred softly, a debt shaped like a message that had never been delivered, heavy as if she had been carrying it on her shoulders for all those years. Poverty pushed from behind, the debt pulled from ahead. Sadie drew in a breath filled with salt mist and stepped through the gate. The kitchen at Ravenhill was as large as her entire apartment, gleaming with stone counters and brass, and packed with eyes that immediately priced her from head to toe before putting her in the lowest drawer. Someone snickered when they saw the glued toes of her shoes. Someone else called out over the sound of the coffee machine, loud enough for her to hear, that Beacon had sent another little mouse. A woman with her hair swept high stepped toward her, moving with the posture of someone in charge, her name tag reading June Calloway. She looked at Sadie as if she were an item delivered to the wrong address, then pressed a silver medicine tray into her hands, the corner of her mouth lifting into a smile Sadie would remember forever. Last room at the end of the east wing. The old mistress. Just take it up, sweetheart. Good luck keeping the job until lunch. Behind June. Someone covered their mouth. A young employee named Wesley secretly lifted his phone, half hidden and half not. Sadie looked at the medicine tray, looked at the long corridor ahead with its dark red carpet stretching into the distance, and asked nothing. She walked all 47 steps down the east wing, counting them from an old habit she couldn't break, and stopped before the final oak door. Behind it, there was a sound like something falling. Sadie placed her hand on the ice-cold brass doorknob. The door opened into a room flooded with morning light yet cold as a museum no one ever visited. On the rug beside the armchair, a tea tray lay tilted on its side, a porcelain cup shattered into 3 pieces, and in the middle of that scene sat an old woman with silver hair in a wheelchair. Her back turned to the window, her bony hands drawing urgent movements in the air that anyone in the kitchen downstairs would have called an episode of agitation. 2 maids were pressed into the farthest corner, one clutching a stack of towels as if it were a shield, the other whispering to Sadie in the voice of someone passing down a rule, telling her to just leave it alone, that Mr. Marsh had said so, that the old woman was only performing, that the more anyone soothed her, the longer it lasted, and the best thing was to clean up and get out. After saying that, the 2 of them slipped through the door and disappeared, fast as if the room were on fire. Sadie didn't leave. She stood still for the length of one breath, and did the one thing no one in this gray stone mansion had bothered to do for the past 4 years. She looked down at the old woman's hands instead of looking at her grimacing face, and in that instant, every sound inside Sadie's head went silent, leaving only the language she had once read under the dim red light of nights when no one was allowed to make a sound. Those movements were not chaotic at all. They repeated themselves, precise and desperate. Left chest, squeezing. Medicine, wrong place. Medicine in the wrong place. The old woman wasn't having an episode. She was speaking, clearly and coherently, to a room full of blind people. Sadie set the silver tray down on the table, stepped forward, and knelt on one knee in front of the wheelchair so that her face was lower than the old woman's, both palms open in front of her according to the courtesy of that language, then signed slowly and clearly. I understand you. Left chest, isn't it? Where was the medicine last kept? The old woman's smoke-colored eyes widened, going still like someone lost in the desert, who had suddenly heard the sound of water. Then her trembling hand pointed toward the cherrywood cabinet beside the bed, the second drawer. But the next sign said someone had cleaned the room and rearranged everything. Sadie opened the second drawer and found only handkerchiefs and a leather-bound Bible. She didn't panic. She reversed the sequence as if turning over a map. A right-handed maid would push things into the higher drawer on the right, and there, in the top drawer, behind the eyeglass case, the small amber medicine bottle lay rolling loosely as if it had been punished. One tablet under the tongue, a glass of warm water, one hand resting lightly on the old woman's shoulder, not pressing down, only letting her know she was no longer alone, and Sadie counted her breathing with her. Slowly now, inhale for 4 counts, hold it, breathe out for 6. The tightness loosened little by little and then released. Quickly and quietly, like a wave withdrawing from a rocky shore, leaving on the old woman's face the exhaustion of someone who had just finished carrying an invisible boulder. The room sank into stillness, the first stillness of that morning that didn't smell of abandonment. Then the old woman lifted her head and looked at Sadie for a very long time, and those thin hands began to move in a completely different way. No longer standard sign language, but shorter, sharper, private as a password. And Sadie recognized every stroke before the meaning even had time to form inside her mind, because some things carved into a person by darkness and cement dust never fade. Where are you, my child? Those 3 words, the old woman signed them in a code where every clean broken line carried the handprint of a man who had once laughed inside a tunnel so his comrades would be less afraid. And Sadie understood at once that this question was not meant for her. It was the question the old woman had been throwing into empty air every day for 4 years, the way people cast letters into the ocean. She should have pretended she didn't understand. Pretending was safe. Pretending was the thing that had kept her and her daughter alive for the past 4 years. But her hands betrayed her before reason could stop them. They lifted on their own and answered with the exact sentence that man had taught her on the final night of his life. I am not lost. Time inside the room froze solid, and what happened next, with her left wrist, with the strip of cloth and the small mark hidden underneath, took place in the span of one choked breath from the old woman, before a voice from the threshold cut everything in half. The man in the charcoal gray suit entered the room neither quickly nor slowly, and the air automatically parted to make way for him as water parts before the bow of a ship. Up close, Ronan Kane was younger than the rumors, but his eyes were older than all of them, the gray of the bay before a storm, sweeping over the medicine tray, sweeping over the broken teacup, sweeping over his mother breathing evenly with the amber bottle in the palm of her hand, then stopping on the woman in an apron kneeling on one knee in the middle of the room. He didn't repeat the question he had already asked. He asked different ones, each one dropping slowly and heavily, like coins lowered into a deep well. Name. Which company sent you? What time did you start here? Who told you to enter this room? Sadie answered each question in the flat, steady voice. She had practiced through hundreds of document checks, her eyes fixed on his tie instead of his eyes, her hands hanging at her sides in the most harmless posture she knew. But the old woman didn't let go. She clutched the faded strip of cloth in her hand as if holding a fragment of bone from the dead, and her gaze moved back and forth between her son and the strange maid, with something smoldering inside it, something no one had seen on that face in 4 years. Ronan Kane saw it too, and perhaps that, more than the medicine tray or the broken teacup, was what made his jaw tighten. He turned toward the door and released one sentence over his shoulder, no louder than the turning of a page, yet it slammed every way out shut like the sound of a lock sliding into place. Follow me. You're not allowed to go home yet. Ronan Kane's study lay at the end of the west wing, past 2 sets of doors and a bodyguard, whose shoulders blocked almost the entire frame, and it didn't look like any study Sadie had ever cleaned in all her years of hired work. No family photographs, no certificates, not one unnecessary object, only dark walnut, a wall of glass looking straight down over the bay where the port cranes stood like a flock of steel herons, and a broad desk on which, arranged with a cold and chilling neatness, there was already a file bearing her name. He sat down, without inviting her to sit, and turned through each page with the unhurried rhythm of a man who had the whole morning to take apart a watch. Sadie Cole. 28 years old, single mother, resident of the East Side. Clean rental history, clean credit history. No criminal record, no bad debt, not even a parking ticket. He read those lines aloud in an even voice, then looked up, and the next sentence was placed on the desk as lightly as a card turned face up. In my line of work, Miss Cole, a dirty record tells me a story, while a record this clean tells me a story someone has rewritten. Sadie kept her eyes fixed on the point between his eyebrows, an old technique, close enough not to be seen as avoidance, far enough that those gray eyes couldn't read anything. Inside her chest, her heart beat with a trained calm, the kind of rhythm she had thought she'd handed back along with the uniform. He turned to the Beacon Company skills form, his index finger stopping on one line. Sign language, fluent level. You listed this to get extra caregiving work, I understand that. It pays more than mopping floors. But what I saw in my mother's room this morning wasn't the fluency of a maid. Who taught you? Sadie had prepared this answer 4 years ago, had worn it smooth like a pebble carried in a pocket, and she took it out in the flattest voice she had. An old neighbor of mine was deaf. I helped her with groceries for years, and she taught me so the two of us could talk. The room was so quiet that the sound of a ship horn could be heard far out in the bay. Ronan Kane didn't nod, didn't shake his head, only looked at her for 3 more seconds with the eyes of a man who had just heard a wrong note in a familiar piece of music. And Sadie understood something that sent a coldness up the back of her neck. He knew. Not that he knew the truth, but that he knew this was a lie, 2 different things, and the second was sometimes more dangerous. This entire city bent its back to tell Ronan Kane the truth. The last person who had lied straight to his face must have done it a very long time ago, so long ago that he seemed almost curious. He closed the file, leaned back in his chair, and delivered his decision in the voice of a man, reading the terms of a contract. Starting today, you work directly for me, no longer through Beacon. Your only duty is to stay beside my mother. Triple pay, weekly, in cash if you want. In return, during working hours, you do not leave Ravenhill grounds, you do not leave the sight of my people, and you do not speak to anyone outside about anything you hear or see in this house. Sadie opened her mouth, and he stopped her first with a sentence that made her whole body stiffen. Except from around 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock in the evening. My car will take you home and pick you up. I know you have a child waiting for dinner at home. It wasn't the kindness in that sentence that chilled Sadie. It was the speed of it. She had stepped through Ravenhill's gate less than 4 hours ago, and this man already knew about Poppy, knew the school dismissal time, perhaps even knew the number of the yellow bus. That was not an offer. It was the way a big fish let a little fish know that the whole pond was already inside its mouth, and whether it spat her back out depended only on its mood. She said yes, because refusing would only make the net tighten, and because a part of her, the part that had knelt beside the wheelchair that morning, didn't want to refuse. When she was let out, a man was standing in the West Wing hallway, waiting for his turn to go in, over 40, close-cropped salt and pepper hair, a suit cheaper than his employer's, but eyes far more expensive, the kind of eyes that missed nothing and forgave nothing. He tilted his head to greet her with a smile thin as a razor blade, introduced himself as Gideon Marsh, head of security for the family, and said he hoped Miss Cole would understand if the procedures caused any inconvenience, that the safety of the Kane household was his life's work. Sadie returned exactly one nod, and when they passed each other, she felt his gaze slide down to her left wrist, where the strip of cloth had been pulled neatly back into place. A look that lasted only half a second, but she had survived long enough to know what half a second meant. That night, after the black car dropped her back in the East Side at exactly 5 o'clock, and Poppy had fallen fast asleep with her 2 crooked braids still refusing to come undone. On the other side of the city, in the row of offices behind Ravenhill's garage, Gideon Marsh sat alone before 2 monitors, one showing Sadie Cole's spotless Beacon file, the other showing a frame pulled from the East Wing hallway camera, enlarged around the woman's hands as they formed signs that didn't appear in any textbook. He lit his first cigarette at 11 o'clock. The light in his office stayed on until 3 o'clock. In the days that followed, Ravenhill witnessed something none of the servants knew how to name. A woman slowly coming back to life, little by little, as slowly as spring crawling through a forgotten garden. Every morning, after the medicine and breakfast were done, the old mistress of the mansion would wheel herself to the south-facing window, where the garden sloped gently down toward the bay, and begin the first conversations she had had in 4 years with someone who truly answered her. She pointed to the cluster of purple flowers beside the gravel path and signed its name, Lavender, then pointed toward the white patch beneath the oak and signed the word Lily of the Valley. And Sadie sat on the low chair beside the wheelchair, answering each name, adding a question, an observation, sometimes a small joke that made those thin shoulders shake with soundless laughter. Her name was Maeve. Sadie learned that not from a file but from Maeve's own hands, when she signed her name on the second morning, along with a sentence that made Sadie bend down and pretend to fix her shoelace to hide her eyes, saying that it had been a very long time since anyone had asked my name. Here they only call me the old mistress, as if naming an aging piece of furniture. And there, beside that window, through story after story stitched together by signs, the past of the house opened before Sadie like an old album being turned by trembling fingers. Maeve's mother, the grandmother of the 2 Kane sons, had been deaf from birth, so Maeve had grown up with 2 languages, one spoken with her mouth to the outside world, and one spoken with her hands to the woman who had nursed and raised her. And of those 2 languages, the language of the hands was where her heart lived. She passed it on to her firstborn son as if passing down a family treasure. Brennan learned his grandmother's language before he was even in 1st grade, and years later, when long business trips through lands not marked on any map allowed him to call home only through flickering screens where every spoken word was forbidden or listened to, it was Brennan himself who created a shortened code from that language, shorter, more secret, understood only by mother and son, so he could tell her that I'm all right, I miss your stew, I'm counting the days until I come home, right in front of censoring eyes that couldn't read a thing. But the younger son was different. Maeve spoke of him with signs that slowed down, as if she were touching an old scar. At 15, the boy had knocked the sign practice notebook onto the floor and said that was something between her and Brennan, that he didn't need to learn the language of people who couldn't speak, that he would learn the language that made the whole city listen. He learned exactly that language. Maeve signed, and her hands stopped in midair for a long while, then lowered into her lap like 2 weary birds. He became the man the whole city had to listen to, while his mother became the person he could no longer hear. That afternoon, when the sunlight slanted across the garden and gilded the edges of the lavender beds, Maeve was teaching Sadie how people from this region signed the name of the wild asters that grew on the cliffs by the bay, when her hands suddenly changed direction halfway through, turning to take both of Sadie's hands, squeezing them with the little strength of her 64 years, and signing one word at a time carefully, as if carving into stone, that for 4 years I have spoken to my son every day with these hands. Every morning I have asked where he is, and for 4 years that room has answered me only with silence. You are the first person who answered. Sadie didn't cry. She had spent nearly all the tears of her life somewhere else, but something inside her chest tilted, like a ship taking on more cargo in a hold that was already full, and neither of the 2 women beside the window knew that at the far end of the long hallway, Ronan Kane had been standing motionless for 6 minutes. He had come by the east wing, intending to spend only 1 minute confirming the daily report, but what he saw had nailed him to the floor. His mother was laughing, truly laughing, her shoulders shaking, and her face bright in a way he had thought had been buried with the summers of his childhood. And she was laughing because of hand movements he looked at and saw only a blank white wall. The man who owned 3 docks, 17 companies, and the fear of an entire city stood outside his mother's conversation like a beggar standing beyond the glass of a restaurant window. He turned on his heel before anyone could notice, and his footsteps that day were heavier than they had been the day before. But if something inside Ronan Kane had shifted, the outside world was not allowed to know it, because that very afternoon Sadie was ordered to bring coffee down to the study and became the unwilling witness to a trial. The man standing in the middle of the rug was the manager of dock number 3, a man broad as a table, with hands full of gold rings, sweat spreading across his collar, explaining that the missing containers were only an accounting mistake. Ronan Kane didn't interrupt, didn't raise his voice, only waited until the man had spoken himself dry, then opened a drawer and took out 2 things, placing them side by side on the desk, a one-way plane ticket and a thin folder, whose cover color alone made the manager's face go pale. You have 10 minutes to choose a new city, Ronan said, his voice not shifting by even one note. After 10 minutes, this file will choose another address for you, one with iron bars and no window looking out to sea. The man, half again as large as his employer, staggered out like someone seasick, and throughout the entire scene, Sadie stood in the corner of the room, with the coffee tray in her hands, not a flicker of disturbance in her. Because she had once witnessed courts where the sentence was carried out before the verdict had finished being spoken. Ronan Kane saw that. He saw a maid witnessing the naked power of the Kane household without her breathing changing at all, her eyes neither turning away nor growing curious, only taking it in, like the eyes of someone used to standing in rooms where human fate was decided. And for the second time in 1 week, the man who believed in nothing but evidence felt a question lodged in the center of his chest that no clean file in the world could answer. There are things the naked eye cannot see, but a mother's eyes never miss them, and Maeve Kane had been a mother long enough to read even the things people hid more carefully than a tattoo beneath a strip of cloth. She began to notice from the smallest details. On the 5th morning, when the kitchen maid brought up the breakfast tray with an extra cup of coffee for Sadie, under the employer's order of triple treatment, Maeve saw the girl lift the cup close to her lips, then set it down a heartbeat too quickly, turning it away with a motion so natural it had clearly been practiced, and from that day on she drank only plain water with a slice of lemon. The following afternoon, the bay wind slammed the glass door shut in the next room, startling them both, and while every hand in the world would have instinctively risen to shield the chest or the face, Sadie's hand lowered instead, fast and discreet, cupping itself beneath her belly like a roof, raised around the most precious thing left of a lost fortune. Maeve saw all of it and said nothing for 2 days, because she too had once been a woman carrying a life inside her in a world that wasn't safe, and she knew how sacred the right to silence could be. But on the morning beside the south-facing window, when Sadie was rearranging the stack of books on the low shelf, and unconsciously resting one hand on her hip in the posture every mother in the world had once stood in, Maeve lightly tapped 2 fingers against the arm of her wheelchair to call her back, then asked with a short chain of signs, not in Brennan's code but in the slow, gentle language of women, "How many months, child?" Sadie stood frozen in the sun-filled room. For 3 seconds, every possible denial ran through her head like a magazine of bullets. Then she looked into those smoke-colored eyes waiting for her, eyes carrying no judgment, only an old and boundless understanding, and every possible answer fell to the floor. 3 months, her hands replied, trembling for the first time since the day she had stepped through Ravenhill's gate. Maeve nodded slowly, then signed another sentence Sadie would carry with her for the rest of her life, that mothers' secrets belong to mothers. And in this house, my hands have kept one secret for 4 years, there's still room enough for one more. And that night, in the small apartment in the East Side, after Poppy had fallen deeply asleep, with her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her chin, Sadie sat for a long time beside the windowsill, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to remember the man who had brought her to this state. Carter Voss had appeared in her life like a pause between storms, the restaurant manager, at the place where she washed dishes on the night shift, the one who always saved her the best employee meal, who always remembered to ask after Poppy on the days the child had a fever, who was always gentle in just the right measure, and at just the right moment, in a way she would only much later understand, was gentleness with a purpose, the gentleness of a man fishing rather than a man giving. 4 years of widowhood and an entire childhood in which no one had ever stroked her hair had made Sadie, a woman who could once read murderous intent in a glance, go blind to exactly one thing, warmth. She had trusted him enough to give him a key to her home, trusted him enough to tell him about the glass jar on top of the refrigerator, and the savings book filled with 4 years of careful scraping for Poppy's future. Then, on the afternoon when she took his hand and placed it on her belly and told him the news with the trembling smile of a woman daring to hope for a second time, he had embraced her, kissed her hair, said this was the best news of his life, and by the next morning had vanished from the city with the jar emptied upside down, the savings book drained dry, and even the silver bracelet that was the last keepsake she still had from a previous life. The woman who had once been awarded a medal now had to hide the very child inside her in order to keep a cleaning job, because Beacon had a clause terminating temporary workers who were pregnant for safety reasons, and because the empty jar on top of the refrigerator didn't give her the right to rest that every mother in the world deserved. She placed her hand on her belly in the dark, where a tiny life was growing without knowing it had been conceived by a lie, and whispered without sound, "It's all right, baby, Mommy has walked through places far darker than this." At that same hour, on the other side of the city, the row of rooms behind Ravenhill's garage was still lit. Gideon Marsh had been sitting before 2 monitors for 3 nights in a row, one showing the enlarged image of the new maid's hands, the other showing photographs he had paid dearly to obtain, from a source he had hoped his whole life never to contact again. Blurred photographs of an unmarked unit in a nameless land, where among armed silhouettes stood a slender figure, a head shorter than the comrades around her, a small dark mark faintly visible on the left wrist. He placed the 2 images side by side, zoomed in, zoomed out, measured every ratio, and the cigarette between his lips burned all the way down to the filter without him noticing. Then he picked up a second phone, a prepaid unregistered kind, dialed a number he knew by heart but had never saved, and when the other end answered in silence, Gideon Marsh spoke in the steady voice of a man reading coordinates, saying that the body at the bottom of the sea that year might still be breathing. "I need confirmation, and if it's true, then we have a problem in the shape of a maid." The person on the other end said something very brief. Gideon nodded alone in the dark, crushed out the cigarette, and his final sentence dropped into the room like the lid of a coffin closing. "Arrange a gift for the Doyle family. On the pier." Friday, on Thursday evening, Ravenhill laid out the first family dinner since Sadie's arrival, a monthly ritual that, according to the servants' whispers, existed only to prove that the Kane household was still a family. The long oak table had 12 seats, but only 4 people sat there, Ronan at the head, Maeve in her wheelchair at his right hand, Chief Attorney Ambrose Foley, with his silver hair, and the smile of a kindly grandfather seated across from her, and Gideon Marsh at the end of the table, while Sadie stood behind Maeve's wheelchair according to her duty, close enough to serve and far enough away to remain invisible. The 5th person entered midway through the appetizer, Dr. Eldon Ross, the family's private physician for the past 2 years, a man with a neatly trimmed beard and a habit of talking about his patients, as if discussing a car in need of maintenance. He stood beside the table, flipped through the medical file, and explained to Ronan in a smooth, professional voice that recently the lady of the house had shown more frequent signs of agitation, more hand-flailing, more resistance to taking her medication, and that to make sure she got enough rest, he recommended increasing her evening sedative dose by half. Only a small adjustment. She would sleep better and disturb the staff less. He said all of that right in front of Maeve, less than 2 arm lengths from her, without once bending down to look at her, as if the wheelchair were a piece of furniture, and the person sitting in it had no ears. But she had ears. She heard every word. Sadie stood behind her, so she saw the whole thing the rest of the dinner table did not see. Maeve's thin hands lifting and beginning to object, slowly, clearly, desperately, saying that "I'm not agitated, that medicine makes me dizzy. It slows my heart, I've been trying to say this for weeks, please don't increase it." Not one pair of eyes lowered to the level of those hands. Foley was nodding along over his glass of wine. Gideon was looking at his phone, Ross waiting for approval of the order, and Ronan. The only person who could stop all of it, with one lift of his eyebrow, was looking straight at the doctor with unreadable gray eyes, because he did not understand the only voice his mother had left. Then everything happened very quickly. The evening sedative Ross had given her before dinner, to prove its effectiveness, began turn against him in the middle of the main course, and this time it was not the dull chest pain from that morning, but a collapse of the whole body. Maeve's complexion turned ash-gray within seconds. Her head sagged to one side, the silver spoon slipped from fingers that had suddenly gone limp, and her breathing slowed, growing shallow, growing thin and far apart, like the sound of waves at low tide. Ross sprang to his feet but froze there, stammering that it was only low blood sugar. "Let me get sugar water." And it was that very moment of hesitation from a man in a white coat that dragged Sadie across the boundary she had sworn never to cross again. She pushed the chair aside, stepped up level with the people she was not allowed to stand level with, pressed 2 fingers to Maeve's carotid artery, glanced at the clock on the wall, and her voice shifted into a register no one at Ravenhill had ever heard, low, sharp, without a single unnecessary note. "Pulse 42, breathing 8 times a minute. This isn't low blood sugar. This is a sedative overdose on top of a weak heart. If you give her sugar water right now, she'll choke. She lowered the back of the wheelchair to an angle, turned Maeve's head to one side to open the airway, loosened her collar, her hands working through a sequence carved into bone, rather than learned from books. Then, without turning her head, she gave orders to a room full of people 100 times more powerful than herself. Call emergency services. Tell them in advance. This is a sedative drug poisoning case in a 64-year-old woman with an underlying heart condition, and to bring the antidote. Doctor, give me the medication bottle you used, right now. Ross obeyed a maid in front of the entire Kane family, and for 4 minutes that felt as long as 4 years, Sadie kept Maeve's breathing steady with her own even-counting voice, one hand never leaving the old woman's wrist as she monitored her pulse, until the emergency team burst in and Maeve had regained enough color to weakly clutch the edge of Sadie's apron. When the stretcher was pushed into the foyer with Maeve stabilized on it, Ross followed Ronan closely, trying to explain himself, saying that an individual reaction was a risk no one could predict, that he had treated her according to protocol with a declining patient unable to report her symptoms for herself. Sadie, who was folding the thin blanket, heard that and straightened her back, and her sentence fell into the marble foyer, every word clear. She has been answering you for 4 years. The fault isn't that she lost her voice. The fault is that no one used their eyes to listen. The whole foyer went utterly silent. Foley gently set down his glass of wine. Gideon looked up from his screen for the first time that evening, and Ronan Kane looked at Sadie for 3 very long seconds, then turned to Dr. Ross. And what happened after that made Sadie understand that the monster of this city had never needed fangs. He did not shout, did not threaten, did not banish anyone from any city. He simply took out his phone, pressed a saved number, and spoke to someone on the other end in a voice as even as someone reading a menu to a chef. Hello, Dr. Whitmore. Sorry to call at this hour. I have something I need to send to the state medical board. 2 years of prescription records from Dr. Eldon Ross for a patient who had lost the ability to use speech. Every prescription, every dosage, every approval signature, along with video from tonight. I'll send it within 1 hour. The rest is a matter of process. He hung up, slipped the phone into his inner pocket, and said his final sentence to Ross without bothering to look at him. Don't worry about having to leave the city. You'll be staying here for a very long time. Only no one will be calling you doctor anymore. Ross stood there with both arms hanging at his sides, not a single hair on his head touched, yet looking as if he had just been skinned alive, and Sadie suddenly understood why all of Ashport lowered its voice when speaking the name Kane. Some people punish with fists. This man punished by erasing you from your own life, politely, cleanly, without leaving a fingerprint. That night, in the black car taking her back to the east side later than usual, Sadie watched the harbor lights drift past the window and asked herself a question more dangerous than any other, that if a man could be both the monster of an entire city and the son standing helplessly outside his mother's conversation, then which part of him was real? On Friday, the hospital confirmed that Maeve was stable enough to be discharged, and Ronan Kane decided to personally go pick up his mother, something that, judging by the undisguised surprise in the bodyguard's eyes, he hadn't done in 4 years. Sadie was ordered to go with them, because no one in the entire convoy except her could speak the old mistress's language, and because after Thursday night, every matter related to Maeve had naturally begun flowing toward her like water seeking low ground. The convoy of 3 black cars left Ravenhill at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Ashport covered in its familiar thin veil of salt mist, and the route back from St. Anselm Hospital forced them to cut across the old pier bridge running along the edge of the bay. A narrow 2-lane stretch, caught between a steel railing overlooking the gray water on one side and a row of rusted sheet metal warehouses on the other, abandoned since the days when the port had still been prosperous. Sadie sat in the middle seat of the second car, beside Maeve, who was dozing beneath a thin blanket spread across her knees, across from Ronan, who was reading something on his phone, and it was precisely because she was sitting in that position that she was the first to see what was wrong. The box truck parked across half the road before the entrance to the bridge, its hood raised, a driver standing beside it, with his arms crossed in the posture of someone waiting for roadside help, but there was no reflective warning triangle, no hazard lights, and the man's eyes weren't on the broken engine. They were counting cars. Sadie hadn't even had time to open her mouth before the first explosion tore the afternoon apart. The lead car jerked to a halt as both front tires burst at once, and from the gap between the two warehouses, muzzle flashes flickered like welding sparks. The bullet-resistant glass beside the receivers of the second car, blooming into a milky white spiderweb. Then a second spiderweb spreading over the first. The driver letting out a strangled groan before collapsing against the steering wheel, the car veering aside, scraping the steel railing in a spray of sparks before dying across the lane. In the first 2 seconds of any ambush, human beings divide into two kinds, those who freeze and those who have been there before. Sadie belonged to the second kind. Her body acted before thought, one hand pressing Maeve's head down below the window line and tucking the blanket around her like a padded nest, the other grabbing Ronan Kane by the collar and yanking him off the seat and down onto the floor of the car at the exact instant. The window where his head had just been resting bloomed with another flower of cracks, and her voice rang through the cabin unlike any voice he had ever heard from her. Not loud, not panicked, each word short and heavy as paving stone. Stay below the glass, no one sits up, no one opens the left door. Then she crawled through the gap between the 2 rows of seats to the front, pulled the gasping driver away from the steering wheel, and into the passenger seat, one hand pressing hard against his shoulder, where blood was soaking through the fabric, her eyes sweeping over the shattered rearview mirror, over the blind spot between the warehouses, over the rhythm of gunfire that was thinning out with deliberate calculation, and her trained mind read the battlefield like reading an open page. 2 firing positions, elevated range, downward cross angle. They're locking the bridgehead but not advancing. They don't plan to swarm in. They're forcing the convoy to bunch up in one place. "Tie," she said to Ronan without turning her head. "Give me your tie, right now." And the man the entire city had to request an appointment to meet removed his gray silk tie faster than any order he had ever obeyed in his life, placed it into that outstretched hand, then lay still on the floor of the car, watching his mother's maid roll the silk strip into a tourniquet around the driver's shoulder, tighten it, twist it, and lock it in place with the silver tie clip, every movement compact and precise as if she had done it 1,000 times in another life. "They've left the right lane open," Sadie continued, her voice still even as a count. "They want us to abandon the cars and run back toward the warehouses. That direction is the real feast table, so we do the opposite." She reached over the driver's shoulder, shifted into reverse, and shouted commands over the radio, crackling with panicked calls from the car behind them. "Car 3, ram the rear and open a path. Reverse at full speed in the right lane. Hug the railing. Don't stop for anything. Leave car 1. People from car 1 stay low and move along the side of car 2. Go." The convoy shuddered into motion under the orders of a woman in an apron, the 3 cars reversing out of the kill zone through the grind of metal, and the sound of bullets tapping against the vehicle bodies, thinning, then dying out completely, exactly as she had read it, because those men had not been paid to chase. They had been paid to make everything look like something. And that something revealed itself at the final curve of the bridge, when the heavy motorcycle of a rear guard roared across the head of the convoy at a safe distance, slow enough for every eye to see the embroidered red wolf crest of the Doyle family on the shoulder of his jacket, displayed so blatantly it was like a business card pinned to his chest. Sadie watched that crest and felt the familiar taste of metal rise in her mouth, because she had seen staged performances like this on another battlefield. A real assassin hid his face to the very end. Only a man who wanted to frame someone wore a uniform to kill. The convoy reached Ravenhill at nightfall, Maeve safe without a scratch and taken straight back to her room by the nurse. The driver picked up by an ambulance right at the gate, with the gray silk tourniquet still perfectly in place, making the medical workers ask one another who had done it, while Ronan Kane stepped down from the car with his collar open, and gray eyes that, for the first time in his life, couldn't fully conceal what was happening behind them. He rounded the front of the car, intending to say something to Sadie, and at that exact moment her legs buckled. Not because she had been hit by anything. The tension that had held itself rigid for the past 40 minutes chose the first safe moment to demand payment, a twisting pain rising from low in her belly that forced Sadie to brace herself against the hallway wall as she slid down, her breathing breaking apart, and both her hands, the hands that had just saved 3 cars and 11 people, now knew only how to cup themselves around her stomach. For 1 second, the stone hallway of Ravenhill froze solid, the bodyguards still not used to seeing their employer take orders from anyone, and now even less certain what to do when the person giving those orders was sliding down the wall. And it was in that frozen second that Ronan Kane crossed through all of them. He dropped to one knee on the stone floor, the left sleeve of his jacket still torn in a long slash from when the car window had exploded and still leaking a dark stain across the gray fabric. But those arms slid beneath Sadie's back and behind her knees and lifted her from the floor as gently as if lifting something that might vanish. And then the whole of Ravenhill, where for 4 years the master's voice had only ever been heard at one cold and even volume, heard Ronan Kane shout for the first time. Call a doctor. Call the port medical helicopter. Don't wait for an ambulance. Rear lawn landing pad. 2 minutes. That shout ran down the corridors like a small earthquake, making a tray fall in the kitchen, making June Calloway stop dead in the middle of the stairs, with her eyes wide open, making people who had believed their employer had no pulse look at one another, and in the arms carrying her past all those faces. Sadie tried to say through broken breaths that I'm all right, it's only a cramp, I just need to be checked, while the man carrying her answered with exactly one sentence. His voice lowered now, but harder than it had been when he shouted, saying that you gave orders for 40 minutes on that bridge. The next 40 minutes belonged to me. The helicopter painted in the colors of the Kane Port Company lifted off from the rear lawn just as the mansion lights came on, and at St. Anselm Hospital. People witnessed something that would be retold during night shifts for years afterward. Ronan Kane stood in the middle of the emergency lobby, one hand still marked with the driver's dried blood, called the private number of the head of obstetrics directly, and when the sleepy doctor on the other end said it was 3 o'clock in the morning and she was off duty, he answered in that familiar menu-reading voice, Dr. Hale, this is Ronan Kane. In 15 minutes, my car will be outside your house. You may wear your pajamas. This hospital's maternity wing is in the building bearing my father's name, and the woman lying inside it is more important than both our sleep put together. Then he sat down. Not in the first-class waiting room, the hospital hurriedly opened, not in the director's leather chair being offered to him, but on the faded blue plastic chair in the hallway right outside the examination room, the kind of chair meant for poor husbands and worried children. And Ronan Kane sat there for 70 minutes, elbows braced on his knees, both hands stained with dried blood clasped tightly together and lifted to his forehead, motionless as a statue carved out of waiting itself. And if anyone had been brave enough to come close, they would have heard his lips moving without sound, repeating something that was not an order, not a calculation, something very much like the words of people kneeling in church, except this man had forgotten how to kneel long ago, so he prayed without knowing he was praying. 70 minutes later, Dr. Hale came out with her hair tied hastily back and the smile of someone bringing good news, saying that all the indicators were good. The cramping was the body's reaction to prolonged stress. Both mother and baby were safe. She needed absolute rest for several days and no disturbance, that was all. Ronan Kane rose from the plastic chair, and the people present in the obstetrics hallway that night would later say they saw the most feared man in Ashport close his eyes for one full breath, as if he had just set down a load heavier than all his docs combined. When he entered the hospital room, Sadie was lying propped against high pillows, her face still pale but her eyes clear again, and she spoke first, saying that I'm sorry for making everything so complicated. I can return to work tomorrow. Ronan pulled the chair closer to the bed, sat down, looked at her for a long while with gray eyes that, for the first time, she saw without any layer of ice over them, then said in a low, slow voice that on that bridge, you saved my mother, saved my people, saved me while carrying a life inside you, and you think what I want to hear right now is an apology. He stood, fastened the button of his jacket as if sealing a document, and declared the thing all of Ravenhill would later know by heart, that from this second on, you and your baby are the most strictly protected assets of the Kane family. Wherever you go, my people go. Wherever you stay, my people stay, and the child of yours in the east side as well, and I'm not asking your opinion. He reached the door, then stopped without turning back, adding one sentence as if speaking to himself, saying that Ty was the gift I hated most. Thank you for giving it a decent ending. And on the other side of the city, in the row of rooms behind Ravenhill's garage, Gideon Marsh sat before the screen, rewinding and replaying the escort vehicle footage again and again, the part showing the woman in an apron crawling between the two rows of seats, reading the battlefield through a shattered rearview mirror, tying a tourniquet with a silk tie in 11 seconds, and giving the retreat order that allowed 3 cars to escape the kill pocket he had paid to seal shut. He watched it for the 9th time, then turned off the screen, sat for a very long time in the darkness with only the red tip of his cigarette flickering, then picked up the prepaid phone, dialed the number he knew by heart, and said exactly 4 words into the silence on the other end. Kestrel is alive. 3 days later, when Sadie had returned to Ravenhill, with the order for absolute rest that she obeyed in her own way, meaning she still sat beside Maeve every morning but let the old woman fight for the right to pour the tea, a rumor began spreading through the mansion with the smell of gunpowder in it, that there would soon be a full security review after the attack on the pier bridge, that the master had ordered every stone in the house turned over, and that the first stone to be turned would be the new maid, the one who had appeared less than 1 month ago, only for the Kane convoy to be ambushed for the first time in a decade. On the night before the review, the black car that took Sadie back to the east side didn't drive straight home as it did every day, but turned instead into an empty parking lot overlooking the bay. And from the second car already waiting there, Ronan Kane stepped over and sat in the seat across from her. No bodyguards, no documents, only the sound of waves striking the stone embankment outside, and 2 people who had survived a kill pocket together. He didn't begin with any ritual. "There's a wolf in my house," he said. The pier attack required 3 things an outsider couldn't have: my mother's discharge schedule, the convoy route, and the weakness of the old bridge. All 3 were kept inside a safe that only a few hands in this house could open. So tomorrow I'm going to let that review happen. I'm going to let them tear your file open across the table, accuse you, corner you against the wall, and I'm going to sit there and watch, because when a trap opens, the guilty one is always the most eager to bury someone else in the pit. He paused, and for the first time since Sadie had known him, those gray eyes lowered, looking at some point on the thin blanket spread across her knees, then lifted again with something close to difficulty in them. "But you're carrying a life inside you, and I've learned in this life that a man isn't allowed to wager what doesn't belong to him, so I'm sitting here to ask, not to order. I need a trap. You're the only bait they'll bite. I won't do it if you say no." The waves struck the stone embankment 3 times in the silence that followed, and Sadie sat looking at the man before her, with a strange feeling rising in her chest that took her a while to name, because she had never tasted it before. All her life, every turn had been steered by someone else's hand, foster families passing her along like a package no one wanted to sign for, the army declaring her dead on paper, without asking whether she wanted to live or die, Carter Voss deciding her future with an early train. Even Ronan Kane's kindness 3 nights earlier had been handed down with the sentence, "I'm not asking your opinion." And yet now, the man who had never had to ask anyone for anything in half a lifetime was sitting here, asking her, waiting for her, and ready to hear her refuse. Sadie heard her own voice answer before she had weighed every risk, and it was a voice she hadn't heard from herself in a very long time, the voice of a soldier making a decision, not the voice of a little mouse running away. "I say yes, but on one condition. When the wolf shows its face, you don't strike right away. You have to let it think it's still safe, because wolves never hunt alone." Ronan Kane looked at her for another second. Then the corner of his mouth moved upward by 1 millimeter, the closest thing to a smile Ravenhill had ever recorded, and as he opened the car door and stepped out, he said, "My mother was right about you from the very first day. I was just slow to understand." The review took place at 10 o'clock the next morning, in the large conference room of the West Wing, where 12 leather chairs surrounded the crescent table, and the portraits of Kane ancestors looked down with eyes of dried oil paint. Gideon Marsh presided over it with the bearing of a prosecutor who had already won, spreading out page after page from the file he called the result of an independent investigation, an enlarged background statement with places that had been erased, a rental contract under another name, photographs of Sadie speaking with a stranger at the bus stop, captioned in the language of implication, and he concluded in a carefully rehearsed voice of regret, saying, "Sir, I'm not saying she's a Doyle spy. I'm only saying every misfortune suffered by this family began the day she stepped through the gate, and in my profession there's no such thing as coincidence. Around the table, heads nodded with the inertia of employees. June Calloway sat in the row of chairs against the wall, reserved for household-level managers, her hands twisting together in her lap, her eyes moving between the file and the strangely calm face of the maid standing in the middle of the room, and anyone sharp enough would have seen that several times she seemed about to speak, then stopped, like someone standing at the edge of cold water, not yet daring to dip a foot in. The only gentle person in the room, as it turned out, was the silver-haired old man seated at the master's right hand. Ambrose Foley waited until Gideon had exhausted his speech, then removed his reading glasses, wiped them with a silk handkerchief, and spoke in the warm, mild voice of a grandfather calming hot-headed grandchildren, saying, Now, Gideon, we're all under strain after what happened. But look at this young woman, a mother with the whole world on her shoulders. I've seen the medical record from that night. The girl saved the mistress and nearly paid for it with her own flesh and blood. I propose we give her a chance to be heard. Fairness is the foundation of this house. Sadie lowered her head in the proper thanks of a servant being defended, and no one in the room saw that behind the chair at the head of the table, Ronan Kane sat with both hands loosely folded before his chin, not looking at the file, not looking at Sadie, but looking one by one at every face around the table, with the eyes of a hunter counting tracks in the snow, recording who said what, who fell silent when, who defended too quickly, and who accused too eagerly, because he was waiting for one lick of the lips. And then, just as Gideon was opening the second folder with the expression of a man saving his heaviest blow for the final act, the double doors of the conference room opened without a knock, and the more than a dozen powerful people of the Kane household turned to see a wheelchair pushing itself into the room, moved by the thin but steady hands of the woman the whole house had believed to be forever voiceless. No one in the conference room moved, because no one knew how to move in the face of that sight. The old mistress of Ravenhill, the woman who for 4 years had only been seen through the frame of a sick room door, or on the walking path with a nurse pushing behind her, was wheeling herself across the threshold of the most powerful room in the family. The thin blanket still spread across her knees, her silver hair neatly combed, and her smoke-colored eyes sweeping the room with a light none of the servants had ever seen in her before. The light of a person who had already made a very large decision. Gideon Marsh reacted first. He stepped away from the position of presiding officer with a gentle smile and the voice of a devoted house steward, saying, Madam, you shouldn't leave your room without a nurse. Let me have someone take you back to rest. What's happening here is only dull internal business. Maeve Kane did not look at him even once. She wheeled past him as if passing an empty chair, moved into the center of the room, stopped in the open space right beside where Sadie was standing, turned the wheelchair to face the crescent table, and all the faces around it, then placed both hands on the armrests, and did the thing the 3 leading specialists in the state had once signed documents declaring she would never be able to do again. She spoke. The first sound did not come out as a complete word. It broke from her throat like a rusted hinge forced open with every bit of strength she had, hoarse, distorted, trembling. The sound of an instrument, forgotten for 4 years in a damp attic, now being drawn into its first note, and it raised gooseflesh along every arm in the room before anyone could even understand what it was. Then she drew breath a second time, deeper, more painful, and this time the name came out clearly, each syllable spelled by all 4 years of silence gathered into one place. Brennan. The reading glasses in Ambrose Foley's hand stopped halfway through being wiped. One senior manager dropped his pen and didn't pick it up. June Calloway lifted both hands to cover her mouth and kept them there, tears streaming through her fingers without her noticing, and Ronan Kane rose from this chair at the head of the table slowly, as if being pulled upward by an invisible cord. He looked at his mother without blinking, and on the face the whole city described as carved from stone, something was literally melting, because the last time he had heard this voice, it had been screaming his brother's name beside a phone fallen on the kitchen floor, and then it had gone silent for 4 years like a lighthouse whose fuse someone had pulled. Maeve was not finished. She raised her right arm, and with a slow, deliberate, unmistakable motion, pointed straight at Sadie Cole's left wrist, where the faded strip of cloth lay still beneath her sleeve, then turned that finger toward her younger son, and her hands shifted into the familiar language. signing each movement large and clear enough for anyone who had studied signs for even 1 hour to read. Ask her about your brother. The room became a photograph. Gideon Marsh stood 3 steps away with the second file still open in his hand, and in one very brief instant, one that only Ronan, from his place at the head of the table looking down over the whole scene, could see, the man's face went completely blank before he managed to put his look of concern back on, like an actor whose stage lights had been cut in the middle of a line. Ronan Kane recorded that half-second in a safe inside his mind, locked it away, then did what the whole room was holding its breath to hear. He dismissed them with a single sentence that allowed no argument, saying the review is over. Everyone out, Marsh, you as well, and no one stands within 20 meters of this room. When the double doors closed behind the last person, only 3 people remained in the room, along with the memorial portraits of the ancestors on the wall. Ronan stepped down from the head of the table, came to kneel on one knee in front of his mother's wheelchair, took the 2 hands that had spent every last bit of strength on a single name, and pressed them to his forehead for a very long time. Then he lifted his head, looked at Sadie, and asked in the voice of a man who had already made room for every worst possible answer, "You knew my brother." Sadie looked at the woman who had burned through 4 years of silence to open a path for her, looked at the man kneeling on the floor with eyes that were no longer the eyes of a boss, and she understood that the door she had been bracing her back against for 4 years had just been lifted off its hinges by the hand of fate itself. She unwound the strip of cloth from her wrist, letting the falcon mark show beneath the conference room lights, and spoke in the calm voice of someone setting down a burden she had carried for far too long. "I was there. The night your brother died. I was the last person with him. And I need you to hear this clearly before anything else. He didn't betray anyone. I don't know what they told you, but Brennan Kane didn't sell out his comrades. He was the one who was sold out." Ronan Kane stood very slowly, and when he spoke his voice dropped, so low it was almost no longer sound, but a movement of air, the kind of voice that those who had once heard it learned never to want to hear again. By whom? Sadie looked straight into those gray eyes and answered with the sentence that would tear open the rest of the story. "The answer is in what I've kept for 4 years. In the room where only 3 people remained, and the afternoon light was slowly leaning across the old portraits, Sadie pulled a chair over and sat level with Maeve's wheelchair, so the old woman could read her lips, and so Sadie's hands would be free to sign the most important parts alongside her words. And then she began telling the story she had buried so deep that sometimes even she had almost believed it belonged to another woman. "My birth name wasn't Cole," she said. "I was once Sergeant First Class Sadie Merrick, a medic with an unmarked reconnaissance unit, and before I was Merrick, I was nobody at all." She had grown up with no one to lose, passed through 7 homes before she turned 18. Then the army gave her a family, and one night at Iron Tide took it all back. My husband was Sergeant Daniel Merrick, a combat medic in the same unit. We were married in a field chapel with a leaking tin roof and a chaplain who smiled through the whole ceremony. And your brother, Mr. Kane, was our second in command. The man the whole team called the tower behind his back, because wherever Brennan Kane stood, people felt there was still a way home. The operation was codenamed Iron Tide. The target was a coastal compound in a land I'm still not allowed to name, and the plan was clean on paper: entry by water, extraction through an old flood tunnel system running beneath the cliffs, everything calculated down to the minute of the falling tide. But that night, we swam into a trap that had already been laid. The retreat route, which only command and the map supply contractor were supposed to know, had been in enemy hands before we ever entered the water. They waited at the exact turns only we should have known, and within 10 minutes, an 11-person team was torn into 2 halves in 2 branches of the tunnel. My half was with Brennan, the other half had Daniel. Sadie stopped there for 1 beat, both hands settling over her belly by reflex, then continued in a voice so even that the evenness itself hurt to hear, saying that the last time I heard my husband's voice was over the radio, when the other tunnel branch began collapsing section by section, and every frequency was filled with the noise of breaking steel. He didn't scream, didn't panic. He only spoke in the same voice he used when coaxing me to eat breakfast, saying, "Get back to our child, I'll be right behind you." And then that frequency went silent, and it has stayed silent until now. Our branch wasn't any better. The exit collapsed behind us, the water rose with the tide, and Brennan Kane did what men like him are born to do. He pushed all 6 survivors from both branches toward the only breathing escape slit left, then turned back alone to hold the narrow stretch of tunnel where the enemy was feeling its way toward us, trading himself for 11 minutes. And those 11 minutes are the reason 6 human beings are still alive somewhere across this country today. When I crawled back to find him, the tunnel ceiling had dropped low, and he could no longer walk. We had just enough time together that neither of us could afford to lie, and in that time, Brennan Kane did 3 things. He took off the dog tag hanging around his neck, showed me the tiny groove along the edge where the tag had been milled hollow and sealed, and said, "Everything is in here, the names, the money trails, the signatures that sold our retreat route. You keep it, and don't trust anyone in uniform until you know that uniform is clean." The second thing he did was teach me a sequence of signs, making me repeat them until I knew them by heart, his mother's private code, and a message in that very code. He told me that if you live and I don't, find her. She will ask you a question she asks every day, and you answer with this. Mother will understand that I'm not lost, I'm only coming home by another road. The third thing he did was smile, the kind of smile I'll never be able to describe properly, and tell me to go. Sadie lifted her eyes to Maeve, whose hands were trembling on the wheelchair arms, but whose eyes were wide, dry, and bright, like someone watching rain return after 4 years of drought, and she finished telling the part that belonged only to her, the part that existed in no report. I made it out to the sea, and woke up on a fishing boat 3 days later, and by the time the system found me, I had already understood how dangerous the dog tag in my hand really was. The names inside it had arms reaching all the way into the highest offices, so they gave me a choice that wasn't a choice. Sergeant First Class Sadie Merrick was killed in action with her husband and comrades. A woman named Sadie Cole was born on paper, with a new job, a new city, and one order only: disappear. They held a funeral for both my husband and me at the Northern Military Cemetery, with an honor guard, a bugle, and 2 flags folded into triangles, and I stood there, Mr. Kane, behind the iron fence outside, with a baseball cap, pulled low and a borrowed raincoat, watching them place the folded flag from my husband's coffin into the hands of a stranger in uniform, because the wife who had the right to receive it, according to the file, was lying in the coffin beside his. For 4 years, twice a year, I have gone to that cemetery at the emptiest hour, with my hat on and my head bowed, and placed flowers 1 row away from those 2 headstones, like a passing stranger remembering the dead by chance, because the second stone in that row is carved with the name S. Merrick, and the dead are not allowed to weep over their own graves. The room went silent for a very long time after that sentence. Maeve Kane slowly lifted both hands, not signing anything, only opening them wide, and Sadie understood that language that needed no learning. She left the chair, knelt beside the wheelchair, and let Brennan's mother hold her, 2 women who had stood on 2 sides of the same stone marker, while behind them, Ronan Kane stood with his back turned, looking out the window toward the bay, his shoulders motionless, only his right hand tightening slowly around the wooden chair back, because inside his mind, 4 years of rumors about his brother's betrayal, 4 years of humiliation bowing his head before the pitying looks of the harbor world, 4 years of his mother's silence and an altar with no portrait, all of it was being rewritten by a stranger's hand, and at the end of that page being rewritten was a line he repeated again and again inside his head like a man sharpening a blade, that he didn't betray anyone. He was the one who was sold out, and the person who sold him out was still somewhere out there, perhaps still breathing, perhaps still laughing, perhaps very close. The afternoon had gone completely dark outside the window when Sadie reached behind her neck, untied the thin cord that had lain beneath her clothes for 4 years, like a part of her own flesh and bone, and the metal dog tag slipped out from beneath her collar, old, worn smooth at the corners. Its face engraved with the name this room had not dared speak aloud for 4 years. She knelt before the wheelchair for the second time that afternoon, but this time it was not to receive an embrace, it was to repay a debt. She took Maeve Kane's wrinkled hand, gently opened each finger as if opening a precious box, placed the dog tag in the center of that palm, then closed the woman's fingers around it. And when the chill of the metal touched the mother's skin, the thin body in the wheelchair gave a faint shudder, as if someone had touched her after a very long sleep. Then Sadie drew back half a step, still kneeling, lifted her face so Maeve could see clearly and began to sign, slower than she had ever signed in her life, each movement rounded and careful, like words being carved into a gravestone. The sequence of signs a man had spent the last of his strength teaching her in the dark, that I'm not lost. I'm only coming home by another road. Maeve Kane read the sentence to the end without blinking, then did something that stopped time in the room. She lifted the dog tag and pressed it against the left side of her chest, exactly over her heart, bowed her head, and held it with both hands as if holding an infant, and her shoulders began to shake. Not a single sound escaped, because even her crying had been taken away by those 4 years. There were only tears falling straight onto the old metal, drop by drop, striking her son's name in the last language every mother in the world understands. The final message had come home, 4 years late, but it had come home. By the window, Ronan Kane had still been standing with his back turned, the room seeing only his shadow against the darkening bay sky. And then those sharp enough to notice saw something all of Ashport would have paid in gold to witness: the shoulders of that man, the shoulders that had never bent beneath any funeral, any sentence, or any gun barrel, were trembling, only slightly 2 beats, 3 beats, like a stone tower realizing its foundation had rested on a lie for 4 years. Then he drew in a very long breath, and when he turned back, his face had gone smooth again, but his eyes had not been quick enough. They were red at the rims and wet at the bottom, and he no longer bothered to hide it. Maeve lifted her head from the dog tag, looked at Sadie for a long while, then took her hand, placed the dog tag back into Sadie's palm, and closed her fingers around it just as Sadie had done for her, then signed slowly that it has traveled with you for 4 years, through places I don't dare imagine. It knows your warmth now. Keep it for another stretch of road, until every debt has been paid. Sadie nodded, slipped the cord back around her neck, then pointed to the edge of the tag, to the groove as fine as a hair that had been sealed with resin, and said to Ronan that what you need is inside this. Half an hour later, on the desk in the West Wing study, beneath the only lamp turned on in the whole building, a memory chip no larger than a little fingernail lay in the center of a black silk cloth like a bullet removed from a wound, and the private technician Ronan trusted most, a quiet old man who had once worked in naval cryptography, inserted it into a reader not connected to any network. The files opened in silence: bank statements from an overseas territory, transfer schedules matching the milestones of the operation down to the exact day, with the code name Iron Tide appearing undisguised, a photographed agreement to provide route information bearing the stamp of a front security consulting company, and on the buyer's signature line, repeated across 4 different documents in unmistakable left-leaning ink, a name that made Ronan Kane's hand slowly tighten against the wooden desk: Gideon Marsh. No one said anything for a long while. Then the old cryptographer was the first to speak, his voice dry as old paper, saying, "Sir, there is something strange. I've broken dirty records for 30 years, and greedy brokers usually leave trails like pigs crossing a field, but the structure of the shell companies in here is completely different. Layers inside layers, locks bracing locks, exemption clauses woven together like steel mesh. The man signing may be Marsh, but whoever designed this maze was educated in a different school, the school of men who swear oaths before a court." Ronan had not yet answered when there came a knock at the door, and Ambrose Foley walked in with his coat over one arm, saying gently that he had heard something was happening, and as chief counsel he asked to be informed. When Ronan, after 3 seconds of consideration, briefly explained the existence of the chip and the name on the signatures, the silver-haired old man listened with exactly the right degree of shock for someone who had just learned there was a wolf sleeping under the same roof, then suggested in a kindly voice, as if offering to pour more tea, that this was now evidence in a major federal crime, and to preserve its legal value, it would be best for the boy to hand it over to him for sealing and storage according to proper procedure, because one mistake in the chain and the defense attorneys would tear it apart in court. The room went still for 1 beat, and Ronan Kane looked at the man who had held him on the day he was born, then answered in a voice as soft and sealed as a cellar door, saying, "Thank you, Uncle, but this thing will sleep in my safe tonight. I want to keep it close. Let's call it a bad habit of a dockman." Foley smiled generously, nodded, did not insist further, wished everyone a good night, and left. And everything should have ended there, like a long night closing, except that 2 hours later, in the night security room, A young employee who was not Gideon Marsh suddenly frowned at monitor 14, rewound the footage from the third-floor hallway of the West Wing, where a man in a maintenance uniform was kneeling beside the elevator control panel with a posture that looked very professional, except that the open toolbox beside him was so new that the hallway light slid across its plastic surface without catching on a single scratch. While all of Ravenhill was silently drawn tight like a bowstring, there was one order Ronan Kane gave that belonged to no defensive plan at all, an order he had handed to two of his quietest men several days earlier, right after the night he sat reading the complete investigation file on Sadie Cole's life, a file she didn't know had grown 3 times thicker since the first day, and inside it was one chapter that made him finish reading, stand up, pour a glass of whiskey, and not drink it, the chapter about a restaurant manager who had vanished from the city with a glass jar bearing a crooked handwritten label and 4 years of a mother's savings book. Find Carter Voss. That was all the order said, and it took the Kane machine exactly 3 days to find him in a highway town 400 miles from Ashport, where he was working as a night shift manager at a bar and flirting with a waitress using the same old deck of practiced tenderness. The meeting took place in the storage room behind the bar, without an appointment, without witnesses, and contrary to every picture Carter Voss imagined, when 2 polite men invited him inside, there wasn't a single blow. Ronan Kane was already sitting there on the only chair, before a plywood table, and through the entire conversation he never stood up, only placed papers on the tabletop one by one, like a man dealing cards. The first sheet was a statement reconstructed down to the last cent, $742 in loose change, and bills folded into quarters from a glass jar. $4,600 from a savings book, opened, with wages earned washing dishes on the night shift. An old silver bracelet valued at $20, in a pawn shop on Harrow Street that he had sold for $15. Carter Voss looked at those numbers and began to sweat, because there was something colder than any threat in the fact that a stranger knew the exact amount of those $15. The second sheet was a prepared employment contract, stamped by a seafood processing company in Alaska, assembly line worker position, 12-hour shifts, shared dormitory, term left blank, and the third sheet was an automatic payment authorization, under which, every month from his wages, a sum would flow into a trust account newly opened in Ashport, under the name of an unborn child he had never once asked about, flowing steadily until the stolen amount had been repaid with interest. And after that it would keep flowing, because as Ronan Kane explained in the voice of a man reading insurance terms, a debt to a glass jar can be paid, but a debt to a child is paid for life. Carter Voss stammered and asked what would happen if he refused, and Ronan Kane fully lifted his eyes to look at him for the first time, a look that lasted long enough for the man to remember exactly whom he was speaking to. Then he said that nothing would happen. You can go on living your life, except every bar, every restaurant, every hotel within 1,000 miles of here buys liquor, fish, and table linens from companies I can reach with one phone call, and you will have absolute freedom in a world where there is no place left willing to hire you. He signed all 3 papers with a hand shaking so badly that his signature came out crooked, and only after he had finished signing did Ronan Kane stand, adjust his cuff, and deliver the final sentence of the meeting in a voice that slowed down, each word set into place like paving stone, saying there is one more thing. She will never know about this conversation. Not a letter, not a call, not one text message, and if you ever think of showing up in front of her one day to take credit. He did not finish the sentence. Some sentences don't need to be finished. They complete themselves inside the listener's imagination. And Carter Voss's imagination must have worked very well that night, because he boarded a flight to Anchorage that very weekend and never returned to the Northeast again. And in Ashport, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, Sadie Cole was folding Poppy's clothes when her phone vibrated with a bank notification. Dear customer, a trust account naming your child as beneficiary has just been activated and has received its first transfer. She read it 5 times, called customer service, and received only the answer that the account had been legally established through a trust office. The settler had requested anonymity. The customer could not close it, and only the child, upon turning 18, would have that right. Sadie sat down on the edge of the bed in the small apartment, looking at the bright screen in the dark, and did something she rarely allowed herself to do. She let 2 tears roll down without wiping them away. Because she did not understand, she could not understand. All her life the world had only taken from her. And never had an unknown hand placed something into her child's hands without demanding it back. And she sat there for a very long time, holding the phone as if holding a question with no answer, not knowing that on the other side of the city, there was a man who had ordered everyone to stay silent, not out of humility, but because he understood something very few powerful men ever understand, that there are gifts that only keep their purity when the person receiving them never knows whom to thank. After the night the chip opened up those names, Ronan Kane tightened Ravenhill like a man tightening the bands around a barrel, and Sadie, along with Poppy by special order, was brought to stay permanently in the East Wing guest suite, a short stretch of hallway from Maeve's room, with the official reason being convenience in caring for the mistress of the house, while the real reason was understood by both adults involved without needing to be spoken. That evening, after Poppy had fallen sound asleep in the room, with a window overlooking the rose garden under the watch of the kindest old nanny in the mansion, Sadie sat reading beside Maeve as she had on most recent nights. Just before 11 o'clock, the entire house suddenly plunged into darkness. It wasn't the kind of brief power loss after which the generator would roar awake and take over according to procedure, a procedure Sadie had silently memorized during her first week. This darkness was complete and prolonged. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, and the backup generator never woke. In that thick silence, Sadie could even hear the ticking hand of the grandfather clock downstairs in the foyer. She set the book down without a sound, and the old brain inside her, the brain she had tried to retire for 4 years, spoke in its familiar cold language, telling her that the generator of a mansion this size had a dual system. It didn't die by accident. It died because there was a hand involved. What she did not yet know was that this hand had been given a key that afternoon, when Wesley Dunn, the young logistic employee, had been approached in the staff cafeteria by a man in a gray suit who introduced himself as being from internal audit, sent by the family's legal office to review the system after the Pier Bridge attack, showed him an authorization letter with a red seal that looked real down to every fiber, and asked to borrow his access card for the technical area for 2 hours, along with a compliment that this report would note the cooperation of promising young employees. And Wesley, who had spent his whole life longing for someone to recognize him, had handed over the card with both hands. In the darkness of the East Wing bedroom, the only light was a thin streak of moonlight through the gap in the curtains, and within that power-cut silence, the first person in the entire mansion to react was not the security team, not Sadie, but the 64-year-old woman sitting in the wheelchair. 4 years without speech had traded Maeve Kane for ears as sharp as a mountain goat's, and she heard what busy ears did not hear, footsteps from the back staircase. She tapped twice, urgently, on the arm of the wheelchair to call Sadie, then her hands signed quickly in the moonlight. Someone is there. Backstairs, one person, wrong footsteps. Sadie leaned close and signed back to ask how they were wrong, and the old woman's answer chilled her spine with its precision, saying that household staff walking at night take short, slow steps because they're afraid of waking people. This person takes long, even steps and stops at every doorframe. Those are the steps of someone counting rooms. In the next 8 seconds, Sadie Cole did the things no manual could teach, the things only knights in nameless lands could teach. She did not choose close combat. Her body now carried 2 lives, and she knew her limits clearly, so she chose the oldest weapon of those weaker in strength, terrain. She pushed Maeve's wheelchair into the inner dressing room of the suite, the only room with a solid core wooden door and no windows, pressed into her hand a phone already set to call the emergency number of the outer security team leader, a type that used a private signal independent of the power grid, then locked the door connecting to the service hallway, tilted the nightstand beneath the main doorknob at the exact angle, where a kick would only drive it deeper into the wooden floor, powered off every light-emitting device in the room, and finally did the thing that made the man approaching commit his first mistake of the night. In the stretch of hallway leading into the East Wing suite hung an antique mirror in a gilded frame. Sadie quietly cracked the door open and turned the mirror 15 degrees out of place, just enough that from the gap in her room door she could see the entire blind corner near the back staircase without showing her face. Then she took the small flashlight she still kept tucked in her apron pocket out of a habit she couldn't break, placed it on top of the bookcase near the door, aimed it toward the corner, and waited. The footsteps drew closer, stopped at the corner exactly as Maeve had read them, and in the angled mirror, Sadie saw the dark shape press its back against the wall in a professional stance, waiting to hear movement. She counted her own breaths to 3, then reached over the top of the bookcase with the handle of a feather duster and clicked on the flashlight. The white beam stabbed straight into the corner, and the intruder, startled by the only source of light in the dead black house, reflexively turned and slipped behind the column, raising one arm to shield the angle of his face. But that very turn exposed him for one full second in the mirror he didn't know had been shifted. 1 second was more than enough for Sadie's eyes. He was wearing Ravenhill's own technical uniform, fingerless electrician's gloves on his hands, and in the beam of light his hands appeared pale, with long, clean fingers and not a single callus, the kind of hands that had never twisted a rusty screw in their life, but had certainly done things requiring a far colder kind of precision. Sadie drew back silently behind the door, slid the secondary latch into place, pressed her back against the wedged bookcase, one hand resting on her belly as if resting on a promise, while her ears registered the footsteps changing direction, not retreating but coming straight toward the East Wing suite now, faster, no longer bothering to hide. And then the door behind her shook violently under a shoulder slam heavy as a sledgehammer. The door withstood the first shove because of the cabinet bracing it, withstood the second because of the angle Sadie had calculated, but by the third, the wood around the hinges began to make death-rattle cracking sounds, and in that brief stretch of time, Sadie swept her eyes around the room one last time. She had already chosen her position, not in the middle of the room where size and strength decided victory, but tight against the wall beside the doorframe, the first blind spot of anyone rushing into a dark room, and in her hands was Maeve's ebony cane with the silver-capped handle, the only thing in the room with enough reach and enough hardness, gripped in both her hands in a horizontal guard, her body remembered better than her mind did. The door burst open. The dark shape lunged in with its own momentum, checked itself for 1/4 of a second before a pitch-black room it had not expected. And in that exact 1/4 of a second, as the man's right arm swung up with something thin and metallic glinting between those uncalloused fingers, Sadie struck the only blow of the entire night, one movement, neat as the sound of a bolt sliding home, the silver-capped end of the cane whipping diagonally down onto the wrist joint in motion. There was a choked cry, and the thin metal object, a small syringe, flew from his hand and rolled with a hollow rattle across the wooden floor beneath the cabinet like a dead insect. The man clutched his wrist and stepped back half a pace, and the second beat of the fight should have happened then, but it never did, because from the far end of the East Wing hallway came the sound of leather shoes pounding across the wooden floor with the speed of a storm. And the intruder's final mistake that night was turning his head to look. Ronan Kane had arrived home at the exact moment the entire mansion went dark, and he had cut through the darkness of his own house without needing a single beam of light, because there are buildings a man knows with his feet, not with his eyes. What happened in that stretch of hallway afterward unfolded so quickly that the memory of the bodyguards who arrived later preserved only a few broken pieces, their employer grabbing the intruder by the shoulder and spinning him around, an elbow, a knee, a joint lock twisting his shoulder until the man was face down on the rug, all of it folded into less time than one long breath, not one wasted motion. The silent and precise violence of a man who had grown up on night docks before he learned how to wear a suit. And when the handheld emergency lights of the security team shone in, they saw Ronan Kane kneeling on one knee, pinning the stranger's back beneath him, hair fallen over his forehead, and at the other end of the hallway stood Sadie Cole. Blocking the door of the dressing room where Maeve had taken shelter, the cane still held crosswise in both hands, the two people at opposite ends of the corridor, between them a solid core wooden door, and behind that door, the mother they were both guarding. The intruder was tied to a chair in the foyer with zip ties from the security team itself, and he sat there with his wrist swollen, his face smooth and anonymous like those who worked in nameless trades, showing no fear whatsoever. The questions from the security captain slid over him like water over taro leaves, until Ronan stepped forward, and the man lifted his eyes to look at the boss of Ashport, with something almost like amusement, releasing exactly one sentence. "You're playing on the wrong level, boy." Then his gaze slipped past Ronan's shoulder and found the woman in an apron, standing beside the wheelchair of the mistress, who had just been brought out, and his smile widened by one notch. He spoke loudly, clearly, deliberately for the whole foyer to hear, saying, "As for you, you should have stayed buried at Iron Tide, Kestrel." The name fell onto the stone foyer like a spent shell casing. The servants clustered at the foot of the stairs looked at one another. June Calloway went pale. Someone whispered, "What is Kestrel? Who is Kestrel?" And Sadie stood in the middle of all those eyes, her back straight, neither confirming nor denying, because she understood that the bound man had just carried out his second task, the task meant for the case in which the first task failed, which was to light the fuse and make her explode in broad daylight. Ronan Kane did not ask the Tide Man another question. He knew this kind of person. The man's payment included silence, and he would honor the contract all the way to a cell. Instead, Ronan walked slowly around the foyer, looking up at the dead cameras hanging on the walls, at the sensors that had gone blind, at the generator control panel that had been tampered with using an internal access card, then stopped in the center of the foyer and spoke, not loudly, but in that silence. Every word drove down like a nail, saying the walls of the Kane house cannot be broken from the outside, so if they fall, the one who broke them is someone I paid to build them. He took out his phone, called the family's chief financial officer at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, and issued an order that made the person on the other end ask him to repeat it twice, freeze every account belonging to every company, every fund, every individual paid within the Kane system from this moment on. Every expense over $1,000 must go through my wet signature, including my own accounts. Yes, you heard correctly, including mine. Every rat has to eat, and I want to see which one panics, first looking for a way out of the grain store. And in that moment, from the staff hallway, a thin body staggered out beneath the emergency lights, face deathly white, both hands clutching an access card as if holding a burning coal. Wesley Dunn collapsed to his knees in the middle of the foyer before his employer and the entire mansion, his voice breaking into pieces, saying, "My card, it was my card." The man in the suit said he was an auditor from the legal office. He had papers. He had a seal, I thought. I only. And then he abandoned every excuse, bowed his head, and spoke the barest truth of his life in the voice of someone skinning himself alive, saying, "I just wanted to be taken seriously. It sounds pathetic because it is pathetic." Colonel Hollis Grant arrived at Ravenhill at noon the next day, following the first call Sadie had made in 4 years to a number she had sworn she would only use when every wall had already fallen, and his appearance in the mansion's main foyer was like a fragment of another world dropping into place. A man past 60, with close-cropped steel-colored hair, a back straight as a carpenter's ruler, and civilian clothes that could not hide 4 decades of military life. He stepped past the servants clustered together, whispering since the night before about the name Kestrel, past the curious measuring eyes, past even Ronan Kane standing at the foot of the stairs waiting for him, to whom he gave only a single proper nod, because his eyes had already found the person he had come to find, the maid standing beside the wheelchair at the end of the foyer, her hair tied low, her apron still marked with the dust of a sleepless night. Hollis Grant stopped 3 paces in front of Sadie, at the exact regulation distance, and in the stone foyer filled with people holding their breath for an interrogation. He did not say a single word. He brought his heels together, pulled his already straight spine even straighter, and raised his right hand to his brow in a slow military salute, complete, solemn, so dignified that the very air around it seemed forced to stand still, the salute of a colonel given to a woman in an apron, lasting 3 seconds, 5 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, 5 seconds, the servants of Ravenhill understood more than every file in the world could have told them. June Calloway lifted a hand to her chest. Someone let out a very soft breath, and Sadie Merrick, after one stunned moment, straightened and returned that salute with her own right hand, precise down to every degree, and her eyes, the eyes that had watched her own funeral from behind an iron fence, were for the first time in 4 years looked upon by a piece of the old world, and called by the right name without a mouth needing to open. The conversation that followed took place in the West Wing study behind closed doors, with only 4 people, and Grant did not bring good news. He placed a single printed sheet on the desk, and spoke in the voice of a man who had delivered too much terrible news in his life to bother circling around it, saying that 3 days ago, your witness protection file was accessed from a point that does not belong to procedure. Someone has an arm long enough to reach into the most sealed storage system in the program, which means the name Sadie Cole, the East Side address, the child's school, everything that S.H.I.E.L.D. has covered for you for the past 4 years, must now be treated as if it's lying on the table of the people who sent a man here last night. I've activated emergency relocation protocol. You have 72 hours to decide. Go with the program into a third identity, or stay outside every protection we can give you. The room fell silent, and in that silence Ambrose Foley, who had been invited to attend as chief counsel, gently removed his reading glasses, wiped them slowly, then spoke in the kind voice of a grandfather worried for his grandchildren, saying, "Colonel, I completely support protecting the girl, and for that very reason, that chip is now the greatest danger hanging over all our heads. Ronan, listen to me this once. Let me transfer it into the trust safe at the law office this afternoon, notarized, sealed, separated from this house, where women and children are living. That is what a grandfather must say." Ronan Kane looked at the silver-haired man for 1 second, then answered in the same soft, sealed voice from the previous night, saying, "Thank you, Uncle, but that thing will stay exactly where it is. This house has just proven that its most dangerous place is still safer than every safe place outside it." Foley nodded generously, did not press again, and only Sadie, from the corner of the room, noticed that the old man's thumb had rubbed the frame of his glasses twice while waiting for the answer, a movement smaller than a blink, the kind of movement she had once learned to catch at negotiation tables where the price was measured in lives. That night, Ravenhill sank into the tense quiet of a fortress after an alarm, and in the East Wing guest suite, Sadie sat alone on the edge of the bed, with her phone glowing in her palm, the screen open to the camera app for the room at the end of the hallway, where Poppy was sleeping deeply beneath a flowered blanket, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, her 2 crooked braids spilled across the pillow, her small chest rising and falling peacefully to the rhythm of dreams no adult was allowed to know. Sadie looked at that image for a very long time, longer than on any other night, her thumb lightly touching the screen where her daughter's cheek appeared, as if she could truly touch it. Then she set the phone down, knelt beside the bed, and pulled out the old canvas bag with frayed straps that for 4 years she had never allowed herself to keep too far from reach. The bag of people who know that every roof may have to be left behind in the space of a single note. She placed it on the bed, unzipped it, and began packing into it the things her mind had already listed long ago, neat, quick, without a sound, like a soldier receiving orders to march, except this time, every few items she packed, her hand paused for one beat on her belly, where there was a tiny passenger who had never been asked for an opinion about any journey. At 4 o'clock in the morning, when the guard shift changed and Ravenhill slackened in the only loose moment of a tense night, Sadie Merrick made the coldest calculation of her life. The kind of calculation only children, who had grown up through 7 homes, knew how to make. That the target of the people out there was her, not the little girl, that Poppy, lying behind the walls of the Kane house, with the ring of protection the boss himself had sworn, was 100 times safer than lying in the arms of a mother being hunted. That every bullet would fly after the name Kestrel, and the only way to pull the line of fire away from the roof under which her child was sleeping was to carry that name far away, fast, alone. She passed well through Maeve's room on weightless feet, placed the dog tag and its cord on the pillow beside the sleeping silver hair, the only thing she had that could say both apology and promise in the same object, then tucked beneath the crack of the West Wing study door a note folded into quarters with Ronan Kane's name on it. Inside it only a set of coordinates and 4 words, safe deposit, copy inside, because she had learned from Brennan that evidence only survived when it existed in 2 places. And finally, she stopped longest before the last door at the end of the East Wing hall, pressing her palm against the wood where, on the other side, her daughter was breathing evenly beneath the flowered blanket, not opening the door, because she knew she wouldn't be able to leave if she saw those crooked braids, only standing there for 1 full minute, her lips moving around a sentence the hallway air alone was allowed to hear. Then she hoisted the canvas bag onto her shoulder and dissolved into Ashport's pre-dawn salt mist. The first person to discover it was not the security team with the newly restored cameras, but the woman with the sharpest ears in the mansion. Maeve Kane woke at 5 minutes to 5 because her hand touched something cold and metallic on the pillow, and she sat upright in the darkness, clutching the dog tag, understanding instantly with the intuition of someone who had once received terrible news before dawn. She wheeled herself to the table, snatched up the phone, and did what she had not done in 4 years. She called her younger son's number. Ronan Kane had been awake all night in the study, with the note of coordinates he had just picked up from beneath the door still in his hand, and when the phone screen lit up with the name Mother, a name that had never called him once since this phone had existed, his heart dropped a beat before he could even answer. He pressed the phone to his ear and heard not a voice, but breathing, quick, trembling, held tight, the breathing of a person forcing everything she wanted to scream into 2 lungs that no longer had an exit. And then through that breathing came a series of dry, small, even sounds, the sound of fingernails tapping against the phone speaker, 3 long taps, a pause, short and long beats following one another in a pattern that took Ronan Kane 2 full seconds to recognize from the deepest part of memory, the code game his brother had once tapped on the bunk bed frame. On nights when the 2 boys stayed awake in secret, the Morse signal chart Brennan had taught throughout the house, as if teaching a harmless game, and only his younger brother had pretended not to care enough to remember. But the body remembered, the body always remembered, and Ronan's lips moved as he translated each tapped rhythm from his silent mother. Home, 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 come home. He understood everything in a flash, the note on the desk, the dog tag on the pillow, the woman in the apron already vanished into the mist. He spoke into the phone, his voice roughened, saying, "I understand, Mother. I'm going to bring her home." Then he ran down to the garage, pushed aside both driver and bodyguard, took the wheel of the first car that had keys, and as the car tore through streets still heavy with sleep, his mind turned through possibilities like pages in a file. Interstate bus station, too exposed, train station, too slow, ferry terminal, too crowded. She was a soldier, and soldiers didn't run by civilian roads. And then he remembered the story told in the conference room, about a woman who for 4 years had placed flowers 1 row away from 2 headstones, and his hands turned the wheel north before reason had time to approve it. The Northern Military Cemetery opened its gates at 6 o'clock, and in the first light of day filtering through the mist, among rows of white stones standing straight as an eternal formation, there was a small figure standing motionless in the eastern section, the canvas bag at her feet, and Ronan Kane walked in from the gate, slowing, then stopping completely at a respectful distance behind her, because he had seen the 2 headstones before her, the name D. Merrick carved on the first, and on the second, S. Merrick, the woman standing before her own grave, one hand resting on her belly, and he heard the second half of the words she was speaking to the stone, saying, I'm sorry, Daniel. I'm sorry I dared to trust one more time and trusted the wrong man. I'm sorry my child almost had to grow up the way I did, without a father, without a home, with only departures. I was going to disappear again, you know. I've always been best at that. But I've been standing here all this time and I can't make my feet move, because this time I don't want to be good at it anymore. The mist held still. Then Sadie's voice changed, still with her back turned, not startled at all, because her ears had caught the sound of footsteps on gravel from 30 meters away. And she asked, as if speaking to the 2 headstones, "Do you know how to be a father, Ronan Kane?" The man standing among the rows of soldiers' graves stayed silent for a very long time, longer than any silence he had ever allowed himself, then answered with the first bare honesty of an entire armored life, saying, "No, my father only taught me how to be a king." He stepped up beside her, looked at the 2 headstones for a while as if greeting 2 soldiers, then turned to her and said the rest in the low voice that had once delivered sentences that made an entire city tremble. Except this time it sentenced no one. It accepted a sentence upon himself, saying, "But I know how to learn. I'm learning my mother's language 20 years late. I'm learning how to be the brother of a hero 4 years late. It isn't too late to learn one more thing, and you listen carefully now. This child was abandoned by one man before it was even born. I won't allow it to be abandoned by the whole world a second time. Come home." That is not a request. Ronan Kane's financial freeze worked exactly like a dredging net dropped to the bottom of the bay. 3 days after the blackout, The chief financial officer reported 27 transactions stopped at the point of wet signature. 26 of them were ordinary operating expenses from ordinary people, but the 27th was a chain of urgent transfer orders linked together like train cars, pulling from the security reserve fund through 3 front service companies into a personal account newly opened at an out-of-state bank, totaling just under $500,000. The authorization code used to sign the order belonged to the highest level of the security division, and only one hand in the entire system had been issued that code. The rat had panicked and gone looking for a way out of the grain store, exactly as Ronan had predicted, only it had run half a day earlier than he expected. When Ronan's team burst into the row of rooms behind the garage, the place had been wiped clean, filing cabinets hanging open, hard drives removed, the ashtray still warm, and almost at the same moment, the gate team's radio crackled with a frantic report that Mr. Marsh had just breached the secure holding area, forced young Dunn into a company vehicle at gunpoint, and slammed through the secondary gate. June Calloway, who happened to be standing in the foyer and heard it, felt her heart clench in front of everyone, because she knew Wesley was pending review, and no one took a witness's statement by driving him out of the house at dusk. The company car's tracker went dead at the turn down toward the old harbor, but Ronan Kane didn't need a tracker. He stood before the bay map in the study for exactly 10 seconds, his finger tracing past the airport with too many cameras, past the interstate with too many way stations, then stopping on the small dot to the south, where Marlow Point Private Marina lay hidden behind the cold storage warehouses. The marina Gideon Marsh himself had advised the family to purchase 6 years earlier, on the grounds of keeping an uncontrolled exit route in reserve, and while putting on his coat, Ronan said only one sentence to the bodyguard captain: "The fox always runs back to the den it dug for itself." The car tore south as evening collapsed quickly around them, salt mist rising thicker from the bay with every mile, and when the high floodlights of Marlow Point appeared blurred like drowned moons, they saw, at the farthest dock, a motor yacht idling with its engine running, its navigation lights dark, and 2 figures moving across the wet wooden planks. The figure in front carried 2 waterproof suitcases, taking long, hurried strides. The figure behind staggered, dragged along by an arm twisted behind his back. Gideon Marsh was no longer the composed steward of the house. His hair whipped upright in the salt wind, and he was pulling Wesley Dunn along like a trembling human shield, the last calculation of a professional, that Kane's people would not dare use force while there was still an innocent body between them. The chase along the dock unfolded in the blurred light of mist, and 3 sounds running after one another, shoes pounding on wooden planks, the yacht engine growling as it held its revs, and breathing, fast broken, white in the cold air. The bodyguard team fanned out to both sides under short commands, blocking access to the side docks, forcing Gideon's path into a single wooden corridor that narrowed with every step, and Ronan Kane walked straight down the middle of that corridor, not running, his long strides even as the rising tide, the distance 20 meters, 15-10, until Gideon Marsh ran out of planks to retreat across. Behind him was the rocking bow of the yacht, and beneath his feet was bay water black as oil. He shoved Wesley forward, sending the young man sprawling across the slick boards, and in the instant the shield left his hand, 2 bodyguards from the left flank surged in and pulled the young employee out of his reach, leaving only 2 men and a stretch of mist at the head of the dock. "You're out of road, Marsh," Ronan said, his breath white in the cold, but his voice not shifting by even 1 note. "Those 2 suitcases of money can't buy you a berth anywhere on this East Coast anymore, and your name is on 4 signatures inside the chip. You've known that since the night it was opened, so talk. Who was behind the pier attack? Who sent the man with the syringe to my mother's room? Talk, and the law will come collect you before I change my mind about who should be allowed to collect you." And Gideon Marsh, backed against the final railing of his life, soaked with mist, breathing like a torn bellows, did the thing veteran losers always do. He laughed. His rough smoker's laugh broke apart in the fog like rotting planks snapping, and he laughed until tears ran from his eyes, then lifted his head to look at his former employer, with the eyes of a gambler, placing his last coin, and said, "The law. You're going to threaten me with the law, boy. You still don't understand a thing. Those 4 signatures are mine, yes. The money passed through my hands, yes. But that maze hiding it is something I could never draw. My mind is only good enough to guard gates. Go home and ask who taught me how to hide money. Ask the man who has spent 40 years pouring tea in your family library. The man who drafted your grandfather's will, read the eulogy at your father's funeral, and held you in his arms on the day you were born. The name was not spoken, but it did not need to be spoken. It fell into the black water between the two men and sank there like an anchor, dragging all the blood from Ronan Kane's face with it. And in the salt mist of Marlowe Point that night, the bodyguard standing 10 meters away would later say they saw their employer stand motionless so long that the mist gathered into droplets on the shoulders of his coat, like a man who had just discovered the house he had lived in all his life had been built over the mouth of a well. The library of Ravenhill was still lit by its familiar lamp when Ronan Kane returned from Marlowe Point close to midnight. Gideon Marsh had been handed over to the federal agents Colonel Grant had called in, along with the 2 suitcases of money still sealed, and in the doorway of the library, between leather-bound shelves rising all the way to the ceiling, and the smell of old paper mixed with cedarwood, Ambrose Foley was sitting in the armchair he had occupied for 40 years, beside the low-burning fireplace, with a silver tea set on the low table. When Ronan stepped in with Sadie behind him, the old man looked up with his eternal kindly smile, lifted the teapot, and filled the second cup that had somehow already been turned upright and waiting, the amber stream falling into the cup without spilling a single drop, that 70-year-old hand not trembling by even one vein, and it was precisely that absence of trembling that told Ronan more than any confession could have, because by tonight the entire mansion knew Gideon had been arrested, and an innocent man should tremble, at least from shock. "Sit down, son," Foley said. "Chamomile tea, the kind you used to call bland when you were a boy. I heard what happened down at the marina. Truly unimaginable. 40 years of reading men, and I let a snake slip right in beside me." Ronan Kane did not sit. He stood in the middle of the room where firelight and darkness split his face in half, and began speaking in a slow, even voice, not accusing but taking inventory, saying, "Do you know, Uncle, the night the chip was opened, my specialist said something I tried to forget. He said the man who signed could be Marsh, but the man who drew the maze had been educated in another school, the school of men who swear oaths before a court. I tried to forget it, because I wouldn't allow myself to think further. Then you asked to keep the chip. The first time that very night, the second time in front of Colonel Grant. Twice, Uncle. An uninvolved man worries about evidence once and then lets it go. Only the man losing sleep over it asks a second time. And tonight, on the dock, Marsh sent me home to ask the man who has spent 40 years pouring tea in this library." A log cracked softly in the fireplace. Foley set the teapot down, removed his reading glasses and folded them, and when he lifted his head, the kindly layer had been taken off and set aside as neatly as a coat worn for many years. Beneath it was a face exhausted, clear-eyed, and so flatly calm it was chilling. He said, his voice still gentle as if reading a will, "You are more like your grandfather than your father. The same habit of counting every piece of evidence before knocking on the door. Fine, then let us not waste words. Yes, that maze was mine. Marsh was only the gate, greedy and stupid just enough to be useful. As for Brennan, Foley stopped for one beat, and this was the only time that night his voice changed, dropping lower, almost with real regret. That boy was too good for his own safety. He traced the money from a scrap of shipping receipt. Right before he deployed, he sat right there in that chair. Do you know what he said? He said, "Uncle Ambrose, I've found a few things wrong in the family fund books. When I come home on leave, I'll sit down with you and look them over." He trusted me right down to that last sentence, and I couldn't let that meeting happen. The money the contractors paid for that extraction route was enough to bury every trace of how I had been hollowing out this fund for 30 years. One arrow, 2 targets. I simply didn't calculate that he would be so good at saving people that night, and I certainly didn't calculate the day a maid carrying his code would walk through this gate. The room fell silent after the confession, a silence thick and heavy as water at the bottom of the bay, and in that silence Ronan Kane took one step toward the armchair, then another. His hands hung at his sides, but his knuckles had turned white, and everyone in the room saw it. That moment when all the rules of civilization thinned, until they were no more than cigarette paper. This man had more than enough reason, more than enough strength, and more than enough complicit silence from 4 walls of books to end everything right here, for the debt owed to his brother, for the 4 years of his mother's silence. And Ambrose Foley sat still in the chair watching him approach, not dodging, like an old spider that had already spun the final web of its life, a web meant to catch the anger of the nephew he had raised. Then a hand settled on Ronan's arm. Sadie had come to stand beside him without anyone noticing, not pulling, not holding him back, only placing her hand there like a small weight set on one side of a tilting scale, and she said, loud enough for all three of them to hear, "Your brother died so 6 people could live. He traded his life for life. Don't let this man trade his death for your soul. Don't let him turn you into something like him." Ronan Kane stood motionless for 3 more breaths, then the whole room heard his 4th breath lengthen and slow. The color returned to his knuckles. He stepped back, adjusted the button of his jacket, as if sliding a sword into its sheath, and pronounced his sentence in the steady voice that had returned to him. "Killing you is a matter of 3 seconds, Ambrose Foley. And in those 3 seconds you would get to die as some pitiful mystery of this family. No, you will live. You will go to federal court with the complete file that your own hands taught me how to read. You will sit for 20 years in a cell, and every morning you wake inside it, you will have an entire long day to remember that what defeated you was not the police, not a rival, but a single mother living on an hourly wage. That is my sentence. The rest belongs to the judge." He took out his phone and called Colonel Grant with only 4 words. "Come to the library. There's more." And while they waited for the sound of the agent's shoes to rise in the hallway, Ronan Kane completed the final act of the longest night of his life. He took from the safe a copy of the evidence about the staged attack on the pier bridge, the photographs of the fake red wolf crests, the transfer orders paying the hired impersonators, placed them in an unsealed envelope, wrote on it an address in the West Harbor district, where the Doyle family had its headquarters, and instructed the courier to deliver it directly by hand with exactly 1 sentence. "I do not owe you an apology. I owe you the truth. The man who wanted our 2 houses to bleed each other dry is behind bars tonight. This war is cancelled." And so, with 1 envelope and 1 sentence, the gang war the mastermind had worked so hard to ignite died on the very night before it had a chance to be born. In the days that followed, Ashport watched one of the largest cases in state history open in absolute silence. No press conference, no sirens, only 2 dark government vehicles leaving Ravenhill at daybreak, with a silver-haired old man still wearing his tweed coat and a former head of security inside. Then sealed boxes leaving the law office on Whitmore Street one after another, offshore accounts being frozen in turn by federal court order, and an indictment as thick as a novel approved by the grand jury, with charges that, even standing alone, could have swallowed the rest of the 2 masterminds' lives. Colonel Grant called Sadie to confirm it in exactly 1 soldier's sentence, saying the chain of evidence is closed. The chip is safe inside the justice system, Kestrel. Your final mission is complete. But the most important thing that happened at Ravenhill after the storm did not appear in any file. It lived in things so small that an outsider walking in would not have noticed them, like the large board that appeared on the kitchen wall right beside the duty roster, printed with hands showing the most basic signs. "Good morning, thank you, what do you need, how can I help?" Along with a line written in red ink at the top by June Calloway herself, that from now on, no one in this house is allowed not to understand the mistress, like the Tuesday and Friday afternoons, when a retired old teacher from the county school for the deaf was invited to the staff dining room, and the person sitting in the front row, back straight, hand raised as she practiced each sign awkwardly, and was corrected without mercy, was the head housekeeper who had ruled this mansion for 15 years with iron discipline. The old teacher rapped her ruler on the table and said that with a wrist as stiff as a broom handle, what word was the mistress supposed to read? Do it again. And June Calloway, who had never let anyone speak harshly to her by even half a word, gritted her teeth and did it again, then did it again, and by the 5th lesson, her fingers had begun to soften, and by the 3rd week the entire kitchen fell to silent when they watched the housekeeper carry a tea tray up to the east wing room, set it down on the table, and instead of lowering her head and withdrawing as she had done for 15 years, stand upright before the wheelchair and lift both trembling hands to sign each slow movement, saying, "Madam, chamomile tea, still hot. If you need anything else, please call me." And Maeve Kane looked at those awkward, grammatically flawed signs for a long while, then answered with a single sign the old teacher had taught the whole class on the first day. "Thank you." June Calloway only allowed herself to lift her sleeve to her face after she had reached the hallway, because there are forms of forgiveness that are not given in words. They are given when someone is willing to answer you. Wesley Dunn was not fired, a decision that surprised the whole mansion. He was transferred to work in the warehouse under supervision, his pay kept the same but every access privilege stripped away, with the condition that he complete a course on security procedure and spend one session each week with a counselor paid for by the family. And when the secretary asked Ronan Kane why he did not dismiss him, he answered with a sentence that would later be repeated across every floor of the house, saying a foolish boy who was deceived because he longed to be taken seriously can still be taught. The people who deserve to be cast out are the ones who made him hunger for it that badly. As for Wesley, on the day he received the decision, he asked permission to see Sadie for exactly 1 minute in the hallway. He did not dare look straight at her, only handed her a folded note with both hands, then bowed his head and walked away. On the paper was a single line written carefully, like someone writing a vow, saying, "I will be better than the person I was that morning." And then, on an early weekday evening, when the mansion had already lit its warm yellow lights, and the smell of baked pastries from the kitchen still lingered on the stairs, Ronan Kane did something that for him was harder than any trial, any business deal, any salt mist night on the dock. He walked all the way down the East Wing hallway, with something tucked beneath his arm, stopped before his mother's door, and knocked 3 times, something he had not done in 4 years, because he had always sent someone else up in his place. The door opened. Maeve was sitting by the window beneath the reading lamp, and she looked up at her younger son standing on the threshold, tall, powerful, and awkward as a boy. Ronan stepped in, pulled the low chair over in front of his mother's wheelchair, sat down lower than her, exactly like a student sitting before a teacher, then placed on his lap the thing he had been carrying under his arm all along, the old sign practice notebook with its cover worn at the corners. The very notebook the 15-year-old boy had knocked to the floor 20 years before, picked up by someone, and kept in a library drawer all those years like a hope too painful to throw away. He opened the first page, lifted his eyes to his mother's, drew in a breath, and asked in a voice all of Ashport had never heard, not the voice of a boss, not the menu-reading voice, or the voice that pronounced sentences, but the voice of a son 20 years late. "Can you teach me, Mother?" 3 months passed through Ravenhill the way 3 months passed through a garden after storm season, without noise, only quiet green shoots rising in places people had thought the soil was dead. Every Monday and Thursday morning, a female speech therapist from St. Anselm Hospital came to work with Maeve Kane in the sun-filled room of the East Wing, and that work looked nothing like a miracle. It looked like a patient construction site, 20-minute breathing exercises, sessions of vibrating the vocal cords before a mirror, when sometimes an entire lesson yielded only one hoarse, clouded sound, days of failure when the old woman pressed her lips together and turned her face toward the window, and the therapist had to gently gather her tools and promise to return next time, because a human voice, after being locked away by grief for 4 years, does not come back through the front door. It returns 1 brick at a time, 1 word a week, some weeks no words at all, and it was that slow, scraping struggle that made every word won back precious as pure gold. Maeve Kane's first complete word came on a Thursday morning at the end of the first month, when Sadie, her belly now clearly rounded beneath the maternity dress whose fabric the old woman herself had chosen, carried in a tray of warm lemon water for the session, and Maeve, instead of signing as she did every day, placed both hands on the arms of the wheelchair, looked straight at her, drew breath from very deep, like someone drawing water from the bottom of a well, and pushed it up through her rusted throat into 2 full syllables. "Thank you." Her voice still rough, still broken, but it was a voice, a real voice, and the whole room froze. The speech therapist sprang up from her chair, while Sadie stood there with the tray of lemon water in her hands, the woman who had stood firm through every storm fate had thrown at her, blinking again and again and unable to hold it back, because out of the millions of words in human language, this mother had chosen the first word she reclaimed after 4 years, not for a name, not for a cry of pain, but for gratitude, and the sign that accompanied those 2 syllables was directed straight at her. But the moment the people working in the mansion would later tell their children and grandchildren about came a few weeks later, on an evening in the small East Wing sitting room, when Ronan came. After 3 months as a student with the worn-covered notebook, after evenings practicing alone in front of the bathroom mirror, which he thought no one knew about, though the entire mansion knew, stood before his mother's wheelchair, drew in a breath like a man preparing to jump from a cliff, and lifted both hands, those large hands that had signed million-dollar contracts and wordless sentences, now trembling as they shaped, clumsily. The first 3 signs of his life, "I am sorry, Mother," except the order of the movements was completely wrong, the grammar turned inside out, so that the Ashport boss's sentence, translated literally, would have meant, "Mother is sorry to me." And Maeve Kane looked at those 3 grammatically wrong signs, paused for 1 second, then laughed, that familiar soundless laughter shaking her thin shoulders, laughing as tears rolled down her wrinkled cheeks faster than she could wipe them away, because that mistake, that clumsy mistake filled with effort, told a mother's heart more than every grammatically perfect sentence in the world. It told her that her son had taught himself, alone, wrong though it was, but with his own hands, and she lifted her hands and signed back very slowly for him to follow, beat by beat, "I am sorry, Mother," like this, then waved for him to bend down and placed on her youngest son's forehead a kiss that had waited 20 years. On the final Sunday of the 3rd month, Ravenhill's south lawn was lush and green beneath early summer sunlight, and anyone standing at the study window looking down would have seen a scene no imagination in Ashport would have dared draw 4 months earlier. A wheelchair parked in the middle of the grass, beside the lavender bed, at its deepest purple. A 6-year-old girl with 2 crooked braids running barefoot back and forth among the flowers, and the silver-haired woman playing the same game she had once played by the window with the child's mother. She pointed at the purple flowers and signed their name. Poppy frowned and copied her, pointed toward the patch of lily of the valley and signed again. Then the little girl turned toward the climbing rosebush, invented a wild sign of her own along with a twirl, and Maeve laughed until her wheelchair shook, lifting her thumb in approval instead of correcting her, just as later, when Sadie came out to sit in the wicker chair nearby, her 6-month belly round beneath the warm sun, Poppy ran over and knelt in the grass, pressing one ear to her mother's belly to listen with the solemn look of a tiny doctor, then looked up and signed for her adopted grandmother to see. Baby, though her pinky curled halfway down in that particular way that belonged to no one else, the way Sadie had never corrected, and Maeve Kane, who was having an entire team of specialists correct each of her syllables every week, looked at that lovely wrong sign and decided not to correct it either. She only signed back, "Baby, yes baby," with her own pinky curled halfway down too, making Poppy shriek with laughter and roll onto the grass because she had done it exactly like her. And in the corner of the East Wing sitting room, where the afternoon sun fell in at its warmest angle, there had been, for several weeks now, a wicker basket, and inside the basket were balls of yarn in cream, butter yellow, and robin egg blue, 2 cherrywood knitting needles, and a half-finished newborn sweater with only 1 sleeve completed. Every evening Maeve knitted a few rows, the stitches slow and even as the rhythm of a promise, and once June caught the old woman pausing her work, resting the whole ball of yarn against her belly for a moment, then signing something to the tiny sweater that no one had time to read, as if she were already speaking to someone on the way. Someone this whole house, in its most awkward and beautiful ways, was learning to speak again from the beginning in order to welcome. The final thing in this story, the piece that changed the meaning of all the other pieces, was found on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, when June Calloway was helping Maeve rearrange the old writing desk in her room to make space for the knitting basket that was growing fuller by the week, and from the deepest drawer, beneath envelopes already yellowed with age, the housekeeper pulled out a thin stack of papers clipped inside a leather folder, copies of correspondence between the mistress and Beacon staffing, stretching across 4 years, entrusted through an intermediary office so no one in the mansion would know, and their contents made June sit down on the edge of the bed because her knees could no longer hold her up. In those letters, steadily, one every quarter, the anonymous client requested that the company give priority to sending workers to Ravenhill who had listed sign language ability, no matter the position, janitorial staff, kitchen help, caregiving, along with a holding fee paid quietly, and beneath them was the list the company had sent back over the years, more than a dozen names who had come and gone. some lasting 3 days, some 1 week, all of them leaving with the same reason noted coldly, that the mistress was difficult, because they knew a few textbook signs, but none of them could read the strange chains of signs the old woman patiently tried with each one, until the final name on the list, flagged as a priority by the company, because of the sign language ability declared in her file, Sadie Cole. June carried the folder to the sitting room with trembling hands, and when Sadie finished reading it, she looked up at Maeve, who was sitting by the window knitting, and that mother only smiled, set the needles down, and signed slowly the explanation she had kept hidden for 4 years, that in the final video call, Brennan signed one sentence to me: "Mother, if I don't come home from this trip, I will send someone home to you in my place. You will recognize that person, because that person will be able to answer you." So I waited. I didn't know who that person would be, man or woman, old or young. I only knew the only way to find them was to try, one person after another. They called me a difficult old woman. Let them. Someone waiting for a promise is not afraid of being misunderstood. And then that morning, you walked in, your hands answered me, and I knew my son had kept his word. The cruel joke in the kitchen, the game of pushing the temporary girl into the difficult mistress's room for amusement before lunch, turned out to be nothing more than the hand of fate borrowing human smallness to finish the promise of a dead man. The person who meant to plant a laugh had accidentally planted a reunion. That evening, on the veranda looking down over the south lawn, after Poppy had fallen asleep, and the whole mansion held only the sound of crickets in the lavender beds, Sadie sat beside Ronan Kane in the comfortable silence of people who no longer had to guard themselves from one another, then asked the question that had lived inside her for weeks, saying, "You've never asked who the baby's father is." And the man of the docks looked out into the darkness scented with grass and answered without needing to think, with the simplest sentence and also the largest one of his life, saying, "I only care who it will call father." And the second word Maeve Kane won back from 4 years of silence, after the thank you she had given Sadie, came on a sunny morning during the usual therapy session, when Sadie signed to her that the doctor said it was a boy, and if she agreed, "I want to name him Brennan," and that mother sat still for a long while, then did not sign her answer. She drew breath from the deepest place of those 4 years and spoke, her voice hoarse, slow, breaking at the final sound but carrying a name whole, "Brennan." Then she nodded and said it again, clearer this time, "Brennan," as if calling a child who was on his way home. Years later, people still told this story incorrectly on the Ashport docks. They said that the Kane family maid turned out to be a warrior in the shadows, that the boss had brought down a traitor hidden in the library for 40 years, that a chip hidden inside a dog tag had destroyed an entire network, and all of those things were true, but none of them was the heart of the story. The heart of it was smaller, more human, and far more aching. It was the story of a group of ordinary people who decided that a mother's poverty and an old woman's silence were acceptable things to use for entertainment. They thought they were laughing at someone weak, not knowing they were standing before 2 of the bravest women they would ever meet. One who kept a promise to the dead through 4 years of running, and one who kept faith with a lost son through 4 years of silence. If this story leaves anything behind, perhaps it is this: never measure a person by their wages or by the volume of their voice, because some people have not lost their voice, they simply have not yet met anyone worth speaking to, and a promise, if it is heavy enough, will always find the hands it needs to come home, while kindness, even something as small as stopping for 3 seconds to look at the hands of someone who cannot speak, can sometimes be the door that opens an entire new life, for someone else and for yourself. Thank you for listening to today's story all the way to the end. If quiet people like Sadie and Maeve have touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, like, and share the video so we can bring you more compelling stories every day. And how do you feel about this story? Which moment moved you the most? Please write it in the comments. We truly look forward to hearing the feelings from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next